Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I don't know whether this is working, but we've been looking forward to hold this seminar, The Politics of Climate Finance and Locally Led Adaptation. We have a full program and a very good line of speakers, so I think we will have a great morning. This is in the background of continuing of breaking records for the climate in the world, and especially 23, 24 saw one after the other with increased temperatures and a lot of catastrophes in terms of rainfall and floods and droughts throughout the world. And it's also in the background of now 10 years after Paris Agreement, where the world agreed to transfer of $100 billion annually for investing in climate. And we've seen the world reach that goal in 22, and last year tripled that goal to 300 billion. However, when we over the last 4 years in the GAP program, which is governing adaptive finance for transformation, we are 14 researchers who now 4 years have been looking into climate finance and the flow of finance for adaptation in Kenya and Tanzania. When we are on the ground, we see very little evidence of relevant support for climate change adaptation. Farmers are to a large extent on their own, and the type of adaptive finance which reach the local level are often not aligned with local priorities. And there's so throughout the last 4 years we've been looking at partly the financial part, the flow, following the money, the flow of finance from the donors through some 2,000 programs in Kenya and Tanzania to local government level, and we are going to discuss that in the morning's program. Secondly, we have been involved in looking at the political economy of the governance of finance for adaptation, and thirdly, we've been looking into these new models of devolved climate finance and the implementation of the locally led adaptation approaches which have been emerging in recent years. Yes, so we have a great alignment of speakers here, including researchers from the GAP program, and particularly the 4 PhD students, where 2 of them have recently successfully defended their PhDs. So we are well on the way, and we have some key speakers from outside, from the foreign ministry and from the NGOs, and so I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Since we started late, I will keep it short and go straight to the first session, and ask Hans Peter to introduce the first session, which will be dealing with the financial aspects of climate change adaptation. Thank you very much and welcome. Yeah. Do you want this one?
No, I think I got it.
Okay.
Could you go for the slide, the last one on 8 principles? Yes, my name is Hans Peter Dejgaard, part of this very great team with people from Tanzania and Kenya sitting here and with Danish. I will keep this on the slide during this short introduction about the principles for local led adaptation, because I tended early in the beginning here to more refer to climate finance figures, and all these figures are around. But I think these 8 principles are illustrating a lot what could be good support to adaptation at local level, and local empowerment, decision making, be informed, be consulted, which we'll come back to in some of the presentations. So these 8 principles is good to have in mind. Copenhagen is still a little bit famous for the failure of the COP15 in Bella Center in 2009, because we could not, the world could not agree in 2009 about a climate agreement, which later became the Paris Agreement in December 2015 in Paris. But there was a declaration, it was not even a formal decision, about $100 billion per year to start in 2020. So the country's got 10 years to start up. And it's called a collective finance, because collective means that you don't point particular quotes to different countries how much you have to pay. It's more collective. Together it should be $100 billion from 2020. They were not even able to reach that in 2020. It was first reached in 2022, which is part of this frustration or maybe lack of trust between the parties. It's called the parties, the countries in the convention or in the Paris Agreement. And then we can see that the adaptation finance is so much prioritized. The Paris Agreement talk about the term balance between mitigation, as almost like renewable energies and all forest mitigation, and adaptation and resilience. And balance, many of us, particularly here, John is one of the people who have really followed the COP negotiations. You will come back to that, John. But we always believe there was more or less 50-50, 50% of adaptation. But in practice, there have been more 20%, 80%, $20 billion and $80 billion. So they have been very unbalanced. That was finally corrected in COP26 in Glasgow 2022, where there was made a decision to double the collective climate finance from the starting point was level 2019, that's 20 billion, and then go very fast up to 40 billion, that double the climate finance within 5-6 years. And how is it today? We are in 2025, so we can now see if this compromise has been met. And we know already that that's not the case. It has increased more or less from 20 to 30, but we still lag a lot, up to $40 billion per year. And even worse, Oxfam, we are here, a couple of people sitting behind Tallulah and Rasmus. We are doing calculation for Oxfam Climate Finance Report, which is a shadow report to the OECD report. And we try also to calculate how much is the grant value of loans, and about 70% of all the climate finance is given by loans and only 30% by grants. And then if we then find out that the grant equivalent, how much the value is that you don't have to repay, is often more about half of the loan is grant, more or less. So therefore, it's much less the countries is getting for adaptation. And the problem also is that it's the countries we talk about, from, for instance, least developing countries, poor Africa countries, they have never created the problem. They did not have the emissions. Africa sub-Sahara is less than 3% of all the emissions coming from Africa sub-Sahara, but then they have to go and rent or get loans from the World Bank for adaptation. Then they have to repay back, and the interest rate has increased in recent years. So we find that a very unfair situation. And the needs, UNEP gap reports have a very interesting calculation of needs, what is needed. and I will not take concrete figures, but it's something like 10%, 10 times more needed than we get. So there's a lot of deficit in lacking climate finance. This program is not only finance and figures. So I think the local led adaptation principles is very much about how are you managing the climate finance, both the international and the national finance, and what we here call in the research the devolution or governance. That will be part of the coming intervention from my colleagues, and based on our 4 years research in Tanzania and Kenya. I will not go through each of these 8 principles. They're very good, but I like, for instance, very much the number 1, devolving decision making to the lowest appropriate level. Subsidiarity principle, I think it's even called, because there's very much that so many decisions are taken in capitals and ministries, and this research have looked into how few decisions are taken at local level where people are living and could handle and do things. And the second one is to address women, youth, children, disabled, indigenous peoples, marginalized groups. That's also very important. But also number 3, John Norbo here, CARE is very close to publish a new report about how predictable the funding is, because all rich countries have had to report a communication to United Nations climate finance in Bonn, and there, John, you will publish a report about that most countries are not really telling the partners in the developing countries, the South, how much will you get in the future. So this principle 3 is also very important, predictability. Yes, I will end here. Tallulah will talk about East Africa, a report that was published in this climate finance report was published last year, before the COP29. Then Henning Nøhr. Henning, you have come the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I find it very important how because that could tend to many NGO projects will probably comply more easily with the 8 principles, but it's very interesting to hear how the Danida and the ministry try to push for upscaling to larger programs with the World Bank and UN and others to upscale these principles to be much bigger than what NGOs can do. So Henning from the ministry, and then Esbern, you will go back and also look at what other donors like Danida, what the others are doing, Sweden, UK, and others. And Pierre, you will be after Tallulah about the devolution of climate change. You, for instance, have compared Kenya and Tanzania, the counties in Kenya, the districts in Tanzania. So I think with this program, I will leave the first to Tallulah to come up here.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. So as Esbern said, we're starting off with kind of tracking the flows of finance at a high level from the donors to the recipient countries. And this is based on a study we published last September as a working paper with DIIS. And I'll go on here so I can move the slides. And the scope of the study was to provide an analysis of public international climate finance from both multilateral and bilateral sources. And that was to the 3 countries of Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda, which are the largest countries in Africa. And we had a particular focus, given the scale of the DIIS project, on adaptation finance flows for the 8 years from 2015 to 2022. And I won't go very in detail on the methodology, but just to say that we used the OECD's climate-related development finance data for this, and you will find the full methodology in the working paper. So diving into the details, in the 8-year period from 2015 to 2022, the total commitments of adaptation finance specifically to the 3 countries amounted to just under $8 billion. But as you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, there was quite significant variation between the 3 countries. So Kenya received around a third more than Tanzania, and in fact, more than double that of Uganda. You'll also see that the amount has increased from 2015 to 2022. So in 2015, there was around $600 million in adaptation finance commitments. And by 2022, that had increased to almost $1.8 billion. So quite a significant increase there. What has been consistent over the 8-year period is that the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, are by far the largest providers of adaptation finance to the 3 countries. In fact, when I say the multilateral development banks, I'm largely talking about the World Bank. So the multilateral development banks account for about 60% of the adaptation finance committed to the 3 countries. And in fact, the World Bank accounts for around 50% of the adaptation finance committed to the 3 countries. And that's actually more than all of the bilateral providers combined. So they account for around 36%. And then in the blue category on the right-hand side, you'll see the kind of other multilateral providers. That's the more specific climate funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, and they account for a very small amount over the entire period, accounting for around 7% in total. Unfortunately, despite the arguments of many NGOs and lots of other actors that grants should be the primary instrument that we use to deliver adaptation finance, what we see over the period is that loans continue to be the main instrument reported for delivery of adaptation finance to the 3 countries. So this is primarily concessional loans, accounting for 60%, as you can see, but also a small amount of non-concessional loans, which account for 7%. What that means is that just 30% of the adaptation finance delivered to the 3 countries in the period actually comes in the form of grants. This is largely driven by a few of the large providers. So, of course, the multilateral development banks, as you would expect, do deliver a lot of their finance in the form of loans. But there are also a few distinguishable bilateral providers, France, Japan, for example, that continue to deliver a significant amount of their adaptation finance in the form of loans. What this means, given the prevalence of the loans in the adaptation finance that's delivered to the 3 countries, is that if we look at the real value of the finance, what we call the grant equivalent value, which Hans Peter has already mentioned, if we do some calculations and adjust the value of the loans to account for just the grant portion of that loan, what we estimate is the actual value of the finance committed is reduced to around $5 billion, which is around 64% of the face value reported amount. And these are our calculations which seek to take into account, for example, the concessionality of the loan, the terms of the loan, and the fact that these loans have to be repaid. The graph on the right-hand side shows the difference in the types of instruments that are used to deliver the adaptation finance to the 3 countries. So Kenya has a much higher share of loans. About 80% of that adaptation finance comes in the form of loans. And what that means is that the grant equivalent value, that's the blue bar, is only around 59% of the face value that the donors have been reporting. Uganda, on the other hand, receives around 50% of their adaptation finance in the form of loans and 50% in the form of grants. So what that means is that their grant equivalent value, that's the real value, we would argue, is actually around 75% of the reported face value amount. It's also important to contextualize these quite big numbers in terms of what recipient countries actually need to deliver on their adaptation finance goals. So the green bar on the left here is the conditional adaptation finance needs from Kenya and Uganda's NDCs. That's what they've reported as needing to deliver on their NDC goals from 2021 to 2030. And you can see that the conditional amount for Kenya is much higher than Uganda, and I haven't displayed Tanzania. That's because Tanzania doesn't provide a breakdown of their climate finance needs by adaptation or mitigation or by conditionality. But they do say that a significant amount of it will depend on international sources. So the green bar for Kenya is $4 billion, which they state that they'll need to meet their NDC by 2030. That's on an annual basis, and $1.5 billion for Uganda. And what you can see is that if we compare the amount of adaptation finance committed, this is displayed for 2022, compared to the adaptation finance needed by the two countries, as stated by their NDCs, there's quite a significant discrepancy. It's also, of course, worth mentioning that it's expected that probably adaptation finance needs are also somewhat underestimated. They're very difficult to measure, and as countries continue to update their NDCs, if they haven't already this year, we do expect adaptation costs to be even higher than already reported. So as Esbern mentioned and Hans Peter mentioned the importance of locally led adaptation and looking at where adaptation finance actually flows. It's unfortunately very difficult in current kind of climate finance reporting methodologies to track how finance is actually delivered or implemented. And that's because the level of information that we need is not readily reported with climate finance donor reporting. What we do have in the OECD dataset, which I've used for the analysis, is this channel of delivery column. It tracks what they call the first implementing partner, which means the main implementing entity that has control over the funds. And what it shows to the three countries over the 8 years is that most of the money has the first implementing partner as the recipient government, with very small amounts having, for example, the local government or NGOs that are based in the country. I think it's worth saying that this all kind of comes with a caveat that this data is, as I said, very limited. In reality, of course, the chain that finance takes is probably a lot more complicated than this, and this unfortunately isn't reflected in current climate finance reporting methodologies. And that's why the DIIS project and looking at how finance is actually delivered on the ground is so important, so we really understand how things are governed and managed. And I'll quickly finalize a very whistle-stop tour of the data with a few key points that came out of the working paper that we published. Of course, it's incredibly important that donors provide adaptation finance not only in line with the specified needs of recipient countries, but also with the needs of those communities that are on the forefront of climate change impacts. We also argue that donors should prioritize grants over loans, specifically for adaptation, and all of this should be underpinned by enhanced transparency in climate finance reporting. Finally, as I mentioned, there is a great need for research that assesses on-the-ground implementation of climate finance and what is actually happening with the communities and other recipients that are receiving climate finance. That is all, just 10 minutes. Yeah. Well done. And thank you.
Well done, and the time.
Minister. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I will follow from Tallulah and Luke, take the analysis a bit further. I will talk about two key issues. One is the
the extent to which local government systems in East Africa are conducive for managing locally led adaptation. And secondly, I'll talk about whether the donor funds, the funds that Tallulah was talking about, actually are devolved in East Africa. The reason why we're talking about devolution to local governments is because it can be argued that it's impossible to take these 8 principles that Hans Peter outlined. It's impossible to take them to scale unless you involve and implement through local governments. There's no other institutions present that can at scale plan and manage adaptation finance. For instance, in Europe, in OECD countries, there are studies that conclude that more than 60% of all adaptation finance is managed through local governments. So adaptation is very much a local issue, and few institutions beyond local governments are capable of managing locally led. So that's why we are looking at these issues. Now, I'll try very briefly to go through to the extent to which local governments are in a position to manage climate adaptation finance and locally led adaptation. And I made a very brief, rapid comparison of the 3 East African countries. They all have fairly strong local governments, but they're very, very different. In Kenya, you have a system with fairly large local governments, whereas in Tanzania and Uganda, they're substantially smaller. In Kenya, they are recently established through the constitution that merged a number of smaller local governments. So there are also big differences in the governance structures below the county level. In Kenya, you don't have formal local government institutions below, but in both Uganda and Tanzania, you have a number, thousands of small local governments that are independent local government entities. With regards to the functions of local governments, then they're fairly similar across the 3 countries. They are managing basic social services, and they're managing a lot of the function that matters when it comes to local adaptation, like agriculture extension, irrigation, water management, roads, rural infrastructure. They are all managed by local governments in all 3 countries. The big difference is that in Kenya, the local governments are not responsible for education. But and that's by far the biggest sector, whereas in Tanzania and Uganda they are. So if you look at the financing of local governments, there are also very big differences. Tallulah talked about some very big figures. Tallulah, next time I would like if you could also highlight what is the per capita financing, because it's a very big billions, but how much money are we talking about? I think it's around, is it $3-4 per capita per year? Of course, there's some that receive less. You saw Kenya received more than Tanzania, etc. But we're talking about that scale. Now, if you look at local governments, how much is the total local government budget in the 3 countries? Then there's some big differences, relative big differences. Kenya is bigger than the others. And these budgets are to cater for all services in the local government. So also the payment of teacher salaries, health worker salaries are the big expenditure items. But there's still, of course, some funds also spent for climate adaptation-specific expenses, which we very roughly try to calculate here. the share being bigger in Kenya, and the total amount of money, the budget per capita is also far bigger in Kenya. Then there's also one other very big difference is in the local governments are in East Africa, contrary to Denmark, are primarily financed by fiscal transfers. So if you look at the relative importance of taxes, is very minor in all three African countries. It's particularly low in Uganda, where it's only 5% of the total budget, but and 10% in Kenya and Tanzania. What is a real big difference is the extent to which local governments can make their own decisions about how they spend money. And in Kenya, the 90% of the funds they receive are non-earmarked. So a local government in Kenya can entirely decide on how it spends its budget. In Tanzania and Uganda, the room for local discretion is very minute. Almost every fiscal transfer is very highly earmarked for a very particular purpose. So the local governments cannot make much decisions on how much they spend on education and health. It's already predetermined. It's already predetermined how much is on salaries, etc. So there are big differences in the way that local governments are ready to capable of addressing climate change adaptation. Then we looked, and when I say we, it's the 4 PhD students and myself, and now no longer PhD students, now doctors, who have been analyzing that very, very big data set that Tallulah was alluding to. Tallulah was just looking at the big picture of how much adaptation finance is going to the 3 countries. We were looking at the individual, around 1,000 projects, and we were looking at all the most valuable projects, trying to identify how much of the adaptation finance is actually going to local governments. Then we were looking at the extent to which the funds were actually reflected in the local government budgets, whether they were going as an official fiscal transfer, whether they were capable of, whether the money is just going to them and they can actually plan for it or they just implement, and also whether there was some, whether the adaptation finance actually built local capacity for adaptation planning. And we saw that there's actually quite a surprising high number of projects that in one way or another is challenged through local governments in Tanzania and Uganda. But whereas the relative number of adaptation projects that are going through local governments in Kenya is quite low. Then we looked at the extent to which they can, whether the local governments can make any kind of prioritization across sectors. And we found that also in using that criteria, also in still in Tanzania and Uganda, it was a higher share. Then we looked at the particular examples of projects, and we could see when it comes to decentralized climate adaptation finance, then there are 3 main types of projects. One which is fully adhering to those principles, locally led adaptation principles, and they are relatively small. They share of the total amount of adaptation finance. In Kenya, it's the FloCCA program we'll hear more about, and then a similar program in Tanzania designed, and another which is supported by the World Bank. And in Tanzania and Uganda, there's a similar program called Locale, where you are which is providing discretionary funding to local governments for adaptation and building the capacities for local governments to undertake local adaptation planning, building capacity for climate risk and vulnerability assessments, and helping local governments to identify what particular areas are more high risk than others, and support implementation. Then by far the biggest amount of adaptation funding that is going to local governments are the two other parts, which is a number of urban development programs, which account for more than $1 billion, social development funds, like Tanzania Social Action Fund, which one of our doctors in the program have analyzed more in depth, and then a number of sector-specific interventions like water projects, climate-smart agriculture projects that are implemented through local governments, but where local governments have very little say about making actual prioritization. And also by the nature of the projects, they are of course confined to a particular sector. So already by doing so, at the local level, they have no say in as to whether they want another type of intervention or not. So the main conclusions from this assessment is that the local government systems in East Africa, they represent very, very different opportunities for and challenges for supporting locally led adaptation, where Kenya clearly stands out compared to the other two countries. And there's these models for development partner funding of climate adaptation that are emerging, but they're still constituting a relatively small part of total adaptation finance, where most of the adaptation finance at the moment, also the adaptation finance that are going to local governments, still is very earmarked and leaves relatively little room for local prioritization. Thank you. I hope I've managed time.
Thanks so much, Per. And now we will jump to Henning Nøhr. You have related very much to adaptation and climate finance in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Danida. So I have noticed that Danida have increased a lot the share of adaptation compared with mitigation from 40 to about 60%. So higher priority in Danida for adaptation support. Yeah, welcome, Henning. Welcome, Henning.
Can you hear me? It's okay. Okay, fine. Thanks a lot, and thank you for asking me to come here today to give a very short presentation on what we're doing in Danida, Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs on adaptation. I'm sitting within the Department for Green Diplomacy and Climate and work with the adaptation team. So we are basically advising not only in Copenhagen but also our embassies and partners on how to work around these issues. I would try to focus a little on financing because I know that that's going to be the red thread through the day. But just to say, it's not all about money. It's also about building systems and capacity. And I think we all agree on that. But just to keep that in mind, also with respect to how we prioritize our work. I think that I'll just put the question up front that something we are boggling quite a lot around is what is real adaptation? And it has a lot of implications on how we work around these issues, because if we're not quite firm about what we call adaptation, it might be very difficult, for example, to track finance streams on this issue. So it's something that I think it's really interesting to see the research you're doing, because we need more consensus, mutual agreement around what is it we track as climate adaptation. We have the Rio markers, of course, we use them. And this is also on that basis that we are able, in fact, to target or to meet the target we have in the Danish Finance Act still. That calls for 30% going for climate financing in general, and 60% of these 30% going for climate adaptation. And I think this year or last year, I think we're around a little more than 3 billion Danish kroner a year that is going for what we call climate adaptation based upon the Rio markers. We also know about the gap. That, I mean, it's not just a question about Danish funds, but globally funds for adaptation are too low. And then the issue around that when we focus on how to design climate adaptation programs, this question about the interrelation with, you may say, good development, because a lot of the adaptation activities are within, you may say, traditional development assistance sectors, like in agriculture, water, nature-based solutions, and then locally led adaptation also. You know how the structure is. We have our bilateral programs. I'm not going to details with that, but just to say that on adaptation, I think a lot of those that we target as adaptation are within water, disaster risk reduction broadly, food security / agriculture and forestry. I would also mention that, in fact, as we also heard, a lot of the climate adaptation funding is coming through the MBDs, the multilateral development banks, MDBs. And just to mention on that, also a lot of the Danish support is in fact going through the for example, the World Bank. The current IDA 21 that has just been negotiated, we are putting in, not just to focus on figures, but a little more than 3 billion Danish kroner, which is quite a lot, in fact, for us. And in fact, we have the target now in the IDA 21 that 45% has to go for climate, 50% of the 45% has to go for adaptation. This is just to show that it's not just us, it's a lot of the donors are talking about adaptation. And I think it also reflects the progression in talking about climate finance, starting up very much with mitigation, realizing that we're not meeting the goal with mitigation. Adaptation is an increasing issue, not at least in developing countries. Then we have a big amount of our funds going through the global climate funds. And I think that's a very interesting discussion around where we put our efforts. You know, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, Loss and Damage Fund, and so on. You all know them. We have quite an architecture around this. We also know that the effectiveness of these funds is to be questioned. And more and more evidence is coming up on that. And I think that's quite worrying for many donors, is that we thought that was a safe way to get climate finance into our partner countries. But it might be a little more complicated. And that comes back to the question about locally led adaptation also. We have the private sector. I'm not going into details, but just to say the new Impact Fund for Denmark, which is a new name for IFU, is doing a lot of investments. I think that one of the problems here is that we talk about getting the private sector and investment on to play around climate adaptation. There is quite a challenge to do private sector investments within adaptation. And even though we have a lot of different financial instruments we put in play, still the question about the business proposition within climate adaptation is a big issue if we talk about that the climate you may say the gap within climate financing for adaptation should be covered by private sector investments. There's also the issue on investment and the ability to pay in these countries, if you may say so, the funding versus the investment. So we might create money for investment, but it tends to be that the ability to pay for these services is low. So it's mainly the public budgets, in fact, that are paying for, you may say, to create the business case for the private sector, which means that a lot of these countries, in fact, is in debt now severely, and which also undermine their general ability, in fact, to build systems and to provide also funding for local level. Then, and that's perhaps my main slide, is the question about what is the potential of the principle for locally led adaptation. We believe they are big, but it's also to see locally led adaptation in the context of the national systems, because I think that we also heard that a lot of the climate financing is now stocked to some extent on national level, national governments and so on. It's not that they are not going to the country to some extent, but they are stocked, and I think that we look quite a lot into building the understanding and the ability of the central government also to work locally. So building these systems that connects locally intervention with national consideration, strategies and decisions. And I think there's quite a lot of work there to do, and I'll come back to a little on what we do on that. as also was mentioned, adaptation is a local context. So there's no doubt about that. Working on with local-led adaptation makes a lot of sense. And I mentioned the effectiveness of these global funds. And I think that there's also an issue, of course, that the very little is going for Africa, which have our priority. That was just as put here. But I think on an issue on the global funds on climate financing and especially adaptation, there is something around that they tend to be, as we said, ineffective because they do not really reach where adaptation should happen. That's on local level. They're stuck in the system, but it's also parallel systems. So there's also an effort now to say that the global funds which we are investing into should be to some extent on budget, because what is important is that the countries have the ability today to do prioritization of how they invest into climate adaptation with their national mobilized funding, which is quite substantial in many of these countries, and then with this additional coming from international funding. So this is something about supporting what we may call country systems, and there's a lot of discussions these days around country platforms, which is a new term coming up in climate discussions. I think the idea is again to have this more coherent approach, and I'm saying this because I think we should also see locally led adaptation in that framing. We are supporting and in general that, for example, within key ministries, national ministries like Minister of Finance, Minister of Planning and so on, that basically are making the big decisions on how funds are dispersed and distributed in the countries. We tend to build more understanding, more capacity on climate, to understand what is climate all about and how to do the good investments. We have this whole of government approach with having all ministries around the table to discuss prioritization on this. We have this, as I mentioned, this building the national capacity for decentralized engagement, which comes back a little to the need for devolution and also for the money to go locally. And then, of course, on top of that, or meeting this national focus, is the locally led approach. So we need to build this, as we all agree, the local capacity to receive, accountability around funding, to disperse, and to some extent also by themselves to define what is they want to do on having investment within climate adaptation. We also have quite a lot of work now going on around the NDCs, the national adaptation plans also, and making them more ready for investments, which is also a part of the national approach. But within those, also the question about how to work around locally led adaptation and investments. And I think that the programs that was mentioned in the last is also what I have, because we have a few examples. And I think the two World Bank approaches we have in Tanzania and Kenya, and also the support we have for Local, I mean, basically try to say, can we build this local capacity to some extent to be a on-level partner with the national government on how to do wise investments on climate adaptation. And I think that what we see now, and this is also why this research is quite interesting, is that what they in fact do of investments on local level, it's sometimes difficult to see what it has to do with climate adaptation, to say it very frankly. And I think this also comes into this question about the accountability of the funding we give. If it is for climate, it should also be for climate adaptation when it's really realized. So it's another, I think, challenge we have. So, and just the last thing is, of course, also coming back to our framework, a lot of the work we are doing on locally led adaptation is in fact what we do through our civil society communities here in Denmark and some of the international institutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Henning. Esbern, I think you will a bit continue from Henning also. What's the situation with the donor community? You have made interviews in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam with embassies, and how others than Henning from Danida, how other countries are handling the adaptation support?
Yes. Yes, I will here talk about a study we made where we tried to look at the evolution of how donor agencies have become involved in climate change adaptation, and to what extent that is translating to what's going on down at the country level. And we decided to take two case studies. One was the World Bank, which is by far the most important organizations for climate change adaptation, and in part we interviewed all the donor agencies in Tanzania and Kenya, or as many as we could get hold of, and just to repeat some what's already been said, that we have reached this goal of 100 billion. The huge problem is how to get funding for tripling this amount, and the amount of 100 billion is largely done through this self-registration process of donor agencies using Rio markers and 3 steps for the MDBs, and that has registered much of the aid, and that made up the 100 billion. Where the next 200 billion should come from, if they should not come from aid, because there is no more money to be registered as climate change is a big question, and the kind of discussions around this is pointing at private sector as where the funding should come from. I'll come back to this a bit later. As Hans Peter mentioned, we now have 28 billion for adaptation in 25, with a Glasgow setting a goal of doubling from 20 to 40 billion, and in 2022, World Bank contributed 43% of climate change adaptation globally. So it's by far the most important organization, and it has a goal of 45% climate finance in 25 and this is so what has happened in the World Bank? I had the chance of spending 3 weeks within the bank. As a fly on the wall, where I went around and carried out some 20 in-depth interviews with staff and middle managers, and I came up to the vice president on the evolution of thinking of support for climate change adaptation within the bank, and I identify 3 main periods. The period up from 8, from the Copenhagen meeting, up to 12, we saw a number of what they call flagship reports coming out of the bank, mainly trying to convince middle management. We had a management of the bank back then, a president, not believing in climate change adaptation. So there was a convincing that middle management of the bank that climate change is a major challenge for development and for the development investments. And I think around 2012 that they achieved that. Then there was a major, I think, a tripling of their climate finance during this period in from 13 to 19. A significant achievement in terms of challenging, partly because of their own convention, and partly from, as Henning was mentioning, pressure from the donor countries to the World Bank for the filling up of every year. It's been gradually increasing, and now it reached 45%. So there's been a pressure from the finance, the country's financing of the bank, but there's also been a real conviction inside the bank of that it's important. And in significant increase in staff engagement. There's 16,500 people in the bank, and there's around 1,000 people working with climate change adaptation, is the figures I was getting there. So a lot of people involved in it. Then I would say from the last 5 years, they have increasingly begun to think about effectiveness and how to use this money for actually reaching the goal of climate change adaptation. Climate change adaptation is just one among several goals within the bank, and these are competing goals. And there are very different opinions within the bank about what, to answer your question, what is climate change adaptation? The FloCCA and the SCALE program, and it's coming in 5 other countries, including Bangladesh. They're developing a huge program. Is a combination of performance-based grants and a smaller grant in terms of grants for capacity development at local governments, and this typically this is a loan given by the bank, and capacity development in the case of both Kenya and Tanzania given by bilaterals of Danida and NORAD and others. This was developed from 2015 to 20 through a $1 million pilot project in Kenya, the FloCCA program, and this is from the department within the bank, which is social inclusion. And that is the one which in the older days were community-driven development. These are the anthropologists, there's social scientists. It took them a whole year to get it through FloCCA program up to the board. Not because it was not a good program, but because of infighting within the bank. It's very much silos. The governance department, which I was embodied in there, had a lot of arguments against it, and as I see it, mostly because they didn't do it themselves. But it was, how a lack of understanding of they are standing for the decentralization process and local government, but also a lot of from the for example, the water department, because we are sending $150 million, but what are they used for? We are giving the responsibility for what they should be used for to local governments, but they wanted to have a say in that for the water project it should be follow these and these principles. So in the end, actually in the bank, it's set up 20% for water, this and this. It's not something they advertised further down, but to get it through the bank to the board, they have to write themselves write things they didn't really want. But this thing about really going for performance-based grants is meeting a lot of resistance inside. And a second group I found which was very interesting is the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. There were like 27 high-end experts who are taking up very much urban side of locally led adaptation. There, for example, in Tanzania, the floods of a third of Tanzania every year. Big political issues with 9 ministries, 27 various other stakeholders, including local areas, the police, the bus company, and so on. And they take on these things and actually create what you can call locally led adaptation in an urban setting. right now they're taking up the floods in Bangladesh as one of these. A very interesting approach, but the large part of the bank is what they call whole of economy approach through the new series of country climate and development reports. There's 57 of them right now, where they mix the two. Where they mainly look at climate change as a black hole. Really, it's like not very well defined, but maybe basically saying if you got increased economic viability of the country, you can pay for some of the climate change hazards to be overcome. So a bit more tricky in what it actually approaches, but perhaps so it's still part of a process of trying to understand what good climate change adaptation is. We went through the strategies of bilateral and multilateral donor agencies to see the process, and just to like if you take Danida as an example here, the rights to a better life from 12 group adaptation and mitigation together, and really and in half a page and really a small contribution to adaptation. World 23 adaptation were mentioned more times, but not as a specific goal. And the world we share from 21 actually has one out of 8 priorities. Climate change adaptation was 1 out of 8 priorities. And similar through here, we have for all of them we see a shift from prioritizing adaptation as a priority. I'm afraid I'm running out of time, am I? Okay, so I won't go into details here, but yeah, just to say that when we came to the ground interviewing the people in 21 and 22 and 23 in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi, we were a bit shocked in saying that almost none of them were really engaged in supporting climate change adaptation. This is the fact that many of these self-registration of climate change adaptation is happening at headquarters and after actually designing the projects. Very few of the bilateral aid organizations were at that time involved in climate change adaptation. Very few of them knew much about locally led adaptation. And there was no coordination among the donors, very little coordination in Tanzania with government, which were not central government. Tanzania is not very supportive of climate change adaptation and more, well, a bit roughly saying that it's something donors should deal with, and it's not a priority within the government itself. At least it hasn't been until very recently with the scale project. So there's basically a huge gap between what is said at these COP conferences. It's beginning to come through the 8 strategies, and it's actually not happening on the ground yet. It's a big super tanker which is slowly moving. Then World Bank is the ones most involved, and Danida, and particularly the embassy in Nairobi was very knowledgeable and very sharp on climate change adaptation, but most of the others were really actually a bit shocking the level of interest, and basically saying we have a strategy and we are still developing it. We know climate change is an issue, but it's not something we are involved in yet. When a new country strategy will come, we will shift. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Esbern. Very interesting.
Okay.
John Norbo from CARE, will you take? John is from CARE Denmark, but you are also very active in the international NGO community on influencing adaptation and climate policies and climate finance. And together with Christian Aid in London, you are in fact leading the Climate Action Network CAN finance group, CAN Finance. So you are in and you're going to Bonn, is it on Sunday? For the next 2 weeks, where the Bonn will very much prepare for the coming COP30 in Belém in Brazil, which will be in November this year. So John, please take the floor.
Thanks, Hans Peter, for the welcome, and thanks to DIIS for the invitation. I think I'm very happy that you have this seminar where you focus on how to make climate finance relevant for those most in need of support. Although you might think it should be otherwise, also in Denmark there is a need for having this discussion about how do we reach those that are most in need. We are in times where some politicians, they think that the focus of our development assistance should be Danish commercial interests. So thanks a lot to DIIS for arranging this seminar and taking up this important issue. As you mentioned, in CARE, we are involved in climate finance. I also have a colleague who is working out of Nairobi, and he's very, very involved in adaptation and the discussions in the Africa group of nations and their negotiators on climate finance and adaptation and so on. So it's not just me doing this work. So when you talk about sort of climate finance in the COP negotiations, then of course the starting point would be the new collective quantified goal that was agreed at COP29 last year. And you might have this impression that developing countries, they would be somehow grateful for the new goal. After all, there was some agreement that the amount, the goal, the core goal, would increase climate finance from $100 billion a year to $300 billion a year. Although in 10 years' time, you might think that developing countries, they would be somewhat grateful. But they are not. And this was the headline from the LDC group when they sort of saw the result of the negotiations and the COP29 ended. A staggering betrayal of the world's most vulnerable. So they were not happy at all. And that's sort of the same feeling you had. I think AOSIS said something similar in their press statement, AOSIS being the small island development states. And at some point, the LDC group of negotiators and the AOSIS negotiators, they actually walked out of the negotiation rooms and took sort of time off to discuss among themselves because they were very unhappy with how the negotiations they were conducted. They simply didn't feel that others would listen to them in these talks. And there was definitely sort of an urge from the COP presidency to make sure that they had a deal and not a disaster from the COP29. So they put a lot of pressure on the poorest countries to accept what was on the table, and what was on the table was what the rich countries were willing to offer. When we had the discussions at COP29, the African group of negotiators, their spokesperson, he commented on the 300 billion goal, and he said it was a joke. When we had the final plenary adopting this decision, you had a very angry Indian lead negotiator. Maybe some of you saw the video from that meeting, but she felt that the new goal was an insult because it wasn't showing that the wealthy countries, they took the lead in solving the climate problem. So we have a situation where most developing countries and the negotiators, they were dissatisfied with the NCQG. They actually feel it's somehow imposed on them. So if you look more into the text, then what is it that they are sort of unhappy with? And it's not just the overall amount. It's also the lack of clarity when it comes to the decisions. As Hans Peter mentioned, we have a lack of balance between support for adaptation and mitigation right now, although it is in the Paris Agreement that there should be this balance. And then the NCQG decision just sort of repeats that there is an aim to balance support for mitigation and adaptation. I mean, if you were very serious and really wanted to live up to the commitments from Paris, then you would set a year, like saying that, okay, maybe adaptation finance is behind right now, but at least in 2030, we will make sure that there is a real balance between adaptation and mitigation finance. The least developed countries and small island development states, they are also unhappy that there is a sort of vague expression of the need to take their or to support them. They would like to have a sort of minimum allocation floor of finance going to these countries because they feel that they have the least capacity to cope with climate change. And I mean, we have in the UN decisions about official development assistance, then you have a sort of a decision that says that 0.15% of DNI should go to the least developed countries. So it would make sense to also have some sort of minimum allocation floor when it comes to these countries in the climate area. Another element of the decision is the text about loss and damage. Loss and damage being a high priority for the developing countries. And then you have only a sentence that recognizes the need for urgent and enhanced action and support for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. There's nothing concrete in this sentence. And in fact, you can interpret the way the overall goals, the 300 billion goal and the wider 1.3 trillion goal, how they are framed in this decision, you can interpret it in a way that you think that loss and damage is not part of these this finance. So, of course, a disappointment for the poorest countries to get such vague language into the decision. But then you could sort of think that, okay, language might be vague, but there is language, and the wealthy countries, they will do their best when it comes to climate finance, they will try to sort of live up to these things. And I mean, unfortunately, the sort of experience shows otherwise, that it's hard to trust the wealthy countries when it comes to climate finance. And also, as Hans Peter mentions, we have a new report coming out actually on Monday, where we've looked into the plans for climate finance from the wealthy countries, and see if those plans somehow correspond to their international commitments. And it's a study that we commissioned INKA to do, and Tallulah is sort of the lead author of our study here. But we looked into all these climate finance plans from the wealthy countries, 27 countries in all, and the plans, they were finalized after the NCQG was adopted. So they came in early this year or late last year. And what we found was that only 7 of these rich countries, they have concrete plans of how to redress the imbalance between finance for adaptation and mitigation. We also found that in reality, it seems that bilateral finance for adaptation will decrease next year by around 10%, and we will have from the donors combined bilateral finance of around $10 billion in 2026. That's far away from the 40 billion that we should have in 2025. Maybe the World Bank will make up for a lot of the shortfall. We don't know. Also because, as you know, there are some discussions about how much the World Bank should focus on climate in the future, as we have a new government in the US. So, I mean, despite having this new NCQG, we might actually see a fall in this kind of support in the coming years. And then when it comes to loss and damage, there's not a single wealthy country that has any kind of quantified goal for their support for loss and damage. So, I mean, there is definitely reason to doubt if wealthy countries, they will live up to their new commitments. And unfortunately, that's a problem not just for adaptation, loss and damage and that kind of stuff. It's a problem for the whole climate regime, because, I mean, as Esbern also mentioned when we started this seminar, we've seen all these records being broken when it comes to global warming, and there's such a need for action, not just in these countries, but all over the world. And unfortunately, the system that should sort of make sure that we have a concerted global effort when it comes to dealing with climate change is undermined by this lack of trust between global north and global south on climate finance. Final slide. In the NCQG decision, there is a paragraph saying that we will have a roadmap being developed at or before COP30, a roadmap to $1.3 trillion. And that's because in the NCQG, we don't just have the 300 billion that's expected to be in support and mobilized finance, there's also an expectation that 1.3 trillion will be channeled into climate activities in developing countries by 2035. And if you read the submissions from the poor countries and developing countries in general, then they see this roadmap to be an opportunity to make up for the failure at COP29. But then if you read the submissions from the wealthy countries, then they underline that the roadmap should not be a negotiated outcome. We should not have something that resembles something that is binding on us. Which of course doesn't really create trust. And then what they focus on is some ways of mobilizing private finance. And I mean, if you think of adaptation and loss and damage being immediate priorities for developing countries, then you have a problem if the focus is on mobilizing private finance. As Henning mentioned, it's hard to see or very difficult to mobilize private finance for adaptation, and it's even harder for loss and damage. So we will have a new battle on climate finance at COP30, but it's so important for the global climate regime that we get over with this, and that we have some countries in the global north that begin to be constructive in these talks. That's it.
Maybe stay up, John. We soon have the break, but if there's just one question to John before he's going for the bond negotiations. Any question? Rolf? Yeah, I think so, because we have online business.
Okay, so my question is maybe a naive one, because I have been a little bit out of touch, but the old sort of NGO and developing country wish to separate development finance from climate finance, is that completely forgotten and dead? You didn't mention that. Used to be a big issue.
Actually, that's a mistake, because I had planned to mention it here right at the end, that what the developed countries, they also want to make sure is that they still have the freedom to shift money away from development assistance and into climate finance if they have to, so that they don't increase the total support. And it's definitely a priority for NGOs to make sure that climate finance is additional, and it has also been a top priority for developing countries in these negotiations. They, I mean, fought hard to the end to make sure that the words new and additional ended up in the text. It didn't. They continued the fight also because we have this financing for development conference in Seville later this month, and they also in those negotiations tried to get into the decision that finance should be climate finance should be additional to official development assistance. So it's definitely a priority, and I simply forgot to mention it.
Okay, now we have a 15 minutes break. I think that includes coffee and tea just outside, isn't it? So 15 minutes break before the next session at. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning and welcome to the second session of our today's workshop. My name is Eric Kioko, and I'm a social anthropologist based at Kenyatta University, and also the lead of the GAP program in Kenya. Let me also first start by commending the earlier presenters who have laid out the figures, the institutions, and a little bit about the devolution aspects. So in this session, we want to dwell on one question. and that is beyond the numbers and figures, is there adaptation at the local level? And if there is, how does it look like? And if there is not, why? So the presenters will look at different aspects around that. But also going to the concept, and I'm happy that the gentleman from the ministry is also keen on the concept adaptation. Adaptation to climate change as a concept has always been come under pressure and particularly criticisms for often overlooking some of the important realities, and this would be country-specific socio-political factors and realities that may also inhibit this capacity, whatever we call capacity, to adapt. I'm putting capacity in quotes because up to now we've never really understood what is that capacity, and do we really have the capacity to be able to do so? Do communities have the capacity to be able to do so? So other factors that emerge to criticize this approach, or that tend to be overlooked, are decision making and power dynamics at both national but also subnational levels. The assumption is that, of course, we've seen the figures. A lot of money, a lot of US dollars have been committed to adaptation or to assist vulnerable communities to adapt. And the assumption then would therefore follow that when that money is given, then would expect some form of outcome in terms of adaptation. There would be something that we can say this is a tangible output or outcome of adaptation. So the decision making, the power dynamics within the countries and also within the nation states, but also at the subnational levels, is something that that has tended to be overlooked. The other thing is about history. We discuss about adaptation in countries, often without looking at the historical patterns, colonialism, post-colonialism, and the struggles that still exist, and the inequalities that still exist. And that really should be something that we think about, the existing inequalities and how that plays out, particularly when we're talking about adaptation financing. Another aspect is national priorities and goals. Of course, this is also linked to the histories. Some countries are very much prioritizing infrastructure, roads, as opposed to even adaptation, whether those roads are actually an adaptation project or not. The priorities differ in specific countries, and that would mean, to some extent, diverting the monies that is meant for adaptation into more pressing priorities. There's also that assumption that devolved structures could be the solution. Well, this is, at least we have seen by comparing Kenya and Tanzania, that this could be something, there could be something in that. But also this could also mean devolving power, devolving a lot of power dynamics and power asymmetries at the local level. So there's also the question, what is the local level here? When we talk about adaptation at the local level, what is this local level? Can we really be able to tangibly say that it is this community? Because communities are also extremely heterogeneous, and their own understanding of adaptation is also quite varying. So the following presenters will look at some of these questions. We will start with the flow of public financing. Judith Mulwa has, she's done a thorough job by unpacking some of the difficult documents that you can find in the state. And it is not easy to actually ask the government to give you information about how money is meant for adaptation has been released. So she was able to manage to do that, and we will look at how this money has been utilized or not, the debt that this brings out at the end of the day, because we know that as Tallulah said, that the funding instruments are always grants or loans accounting for 70%. What is the implication of this, particularly for Kenya and also for Tanzania? Marie Grefferson will look at one of the projects that was listed by Hans Peter as one of the largest projects that is receiving adaptation funds. And she will be answering the question, what does that mean? What does it look at the local level? Are we delivering something? And if we are doing so, what? And then we'll have a presentation also from Tanzania on the political issues around political will, and then climate change financing decisions from Tanzania. Is Nøhr around? Okay, good. They will be coming in through the virtual infrastructure. So we start with Judith. Please take the floor. We try to keep time. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm going to look at or allude to some of the issues that have been mentioned in the first half of the session, or the half of the session that we just had, and it's looking at matters if really when we are borrowing climate adaptation finance, or when countries are borrowing, does it really speak to adaptation finance? And then my main question is then adaptation finance an economic concern or a developmental concern, as we are now? And when you're talking about an economic concern, I think I went further to look into, is it really defined by instruments, rightly said earlier on? Is it matters macro fiscal constraints? Is it the credit worthiness of the sovereign states? Or, as Eric has just alluded, when you're looking into matters, the development imperative, then are you looking at it from a public goods theory, because you're looking into investing into something, and what's the quality of that? Is it on vulnerabilities, or is it on matters justice? So just to go really fast, because I only have 10 minutes, when you're looking into matters financing and how decisions are made in terms of the flow and use of financing, it is very clear that as is now, it is based on negotiations that have been done earlier on, rightly said, in terms of the agreements. It's also as to matters institutional preferences. And when you're talking about institutional preferences, it's already defined that, look, we are coming from a place of, the likes of the MDBs, the World Banks, the Africa Development Bank, but then we will only provide money to a sovereign state or to the centralized system. And when you're looking into the fiscal, then when they're doing that, they're just not flowing. Money doesn't flow from the World Bank or from the Africa Development Bank. They have to have specific characteristics. You as a country, what are your fiscal characteristics? Are you, a middle income country? Are you a low income country? And this is how, so far, these are some of the determinants as to how money is flowing. And we see the likes of the World Bank and the Africa Development Bank, as Tallulah mentioned, this is where a lot of the money is coming from, channeled to developing countries such as Kenya, but it is in the form of debt, and rightly so. For Kenya specifically, because now we're a middle income country, actually this year, again, we're supposed to be rebased to see whether we're going a notch higher. So that means, in essence, that we're not receiving a lot of grants, we're receiving more debt. And you can see it's also replicated even at national level when you're looking at the national revenue. And before I go to the national revenue, I think it is also imperative to say that you're looking at the World Bank, and then you have the likes of the GCF and Adaptation Fund, and you said, and I think these were designed to make things easier so that countries can actually access, and then the locally led adaptation can also be experienced. But even for them, they have their own requirements that you as a country, you need to have a matching grant, need to have, so it's still within the fiscal dimension. And so you see, that was at international level. But when you go to the national level, you see that public debt servicing, as we'll see later on, it takes the bigger chunk, where you're looking at into matters, taxation and such, or internal borrowing. And this is what streams into the national budget. But just to mention also that in that kind of scenario where we're looking at whether it's consensual or non-consensual loans, unfortunately, it's still a loan. So this means that it's competing with the fiscal space, and this has, it's very detrimental in terms of development, because if you're competing with fiscal space, it means that you can be not wiped out per se, but you can have budget cuts and things like that. So is it really then a developmental issue, or decisions even at national level, are they really made as far as the economic stature and the economic, or rather the inflation and currency issues are concerned? But then later on, we'll see how Makueni then, which is the subnational level that I'm focusing on, how is it affected as far as the fiscal architecture is concerned, and the PFMA. So really quick with the figures that I got, we see that Kenya has received USD 4.64 billion. And just to show, maybe let me come here, just to show that it goes up, but then in 2020, it skyrockets. What happened in 2020? COVID. Yeah. So what does this say? It simply says even, during the COVID time, a lot of what was COVID was also tagged as climate adaptation in Kenya. And it also means that the fiscal regulations, because money just doesn't move at country level, they were relaxed, for lack of a better word. And this is why there was a spike. And right after COVID, it came back. And you can see we don't have data 2022, 2024, but the projection would be almost the same, So this also means that in terms of climate tagging, a lot of what is being tagged, as you earlier on said, it's not really climate adaptation. As alluded earlier on, we can see this is internally, when you're looking at the sources of revenue, this is for the overall national expenditure, but lensing of 2021, 2022, you can see that the biggest chunk is tax revenue, and it's also because we are a middle income country, and then domestic borrowing comes in second. And this has everything to do with, looking at when you're tracing the budget to see how much revenue is in Kenya, but how much also can be a potential source as far as climate adaptation is concerned. So internally, taxation would be our internal source. Financial instruments and their paradoxes, I think this is very clear, where we see that between 2013 and 2021, 89% was consensual and developmental, which is great, because in 2014, this is when we were categorized as a low middle income country. But then 10% fell on unconsensual categories, and then 2% on private consent. So you can see that a lot of it still goes in terms of debt for the country. And also looking at matters consensuality. So remember, here we have said that 89% is consensual, but around this time, in 2018, we saw a spike in terms of the non-consensuality. So this means the likes of the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank, they decided that we're not giving any more consensual or minimal consensual. So it means now matters non-consensual became kind of spiked. So this means we're actually paying for what is supposed to be a very developmental issue. Now we are literally paying for it, because now it's non-consensual. As you have seen, then this then streams to the national stature, where we see half of the revenue, the taxation will be used for, not developmental issues, but to repay our debt on climate. So I'm looking at the time. So why this is important, as I mentioned, when you're talking about debt and consensuality and unconsensualities, it has everything to do with fiscal space. So what do countries like Kenya do? They decide to come up with financial innovations, the likes of the debt swap, and this one is particularly by WFP and the National Treasury, where you decide to swap your debt for particular developmental outcomes. And particularly in this one, it's on food security. So this is important because then it creates that fiscal space. And that fiscal space means that you have space to invest in other things. It's like you're exchanging debt for something else. And we have seen the likes of France, Germany, being very interested in this sort of financial innovations. This will be coming up in a lot of developing countries because then it's the only way to swap. And I think I've seen also some in Latin America as far as debt swaps are concerned. But not to say that for them to function, as I have said, there needs to be political will, but then renegotiation in terms of the financial restructuring terms. And the most important thing, as Eric always reminds me, well, how does it impact the people? It has to be in line with the justice, making sure that the financing goes to the people. Otherwise, then it will still be the same as the likes of the financing we're getting from the World Bank, still the same as the financing we're getting from the Adaptation Fund, that it's very centralized and it doesn't stream to the decentralized system. Again, when financing, just to mention, the disbursement channels, it's very clear. When financing comes into Kenya, it is direct to, majority of it is to the central government, whether we like it or not. So majority of it is on budget. You can see that I think it's 71% on budget and 29% off budget. But as you know, it's very difficult to trace off budget. And this simply means that even with the financing institutions that are giving financing to Kenya, they still prefer accountability systems. They still prefer, despite the fact that these accountability systems don't necessarily move to the decentralized or to the local communities, or decentralized systems do not feed into the decentralized systems or the communities, this is still the preference. This is very interesting. I'm almost done. That when you look at the OECD to Kenya, you can see the priorities. Highest being in agriculture and then supply in the color codes. But when it gets to the national government, it changes, it morphs. The priority is transport and infrastructure, and then health and national planning. Then when it gets to the subnational level, it changes again. This is the same money that we receive from the OECD. It changes to water access, ecosystem restoration, and agricultural resilience, which is what now is what we call climate vulnerabilities. But when it started, agriculture is climate vulnerabilities, but in here something happened. So there was that change. This is my favorite graph. As you can see, it starts 100%, 30% absorbed into the national budget. So the 70%, I would consider it off budget. So 30% on budget. This is what is absorbed into the national system. 8 to 12% is what gets to my grandmother. And chances are, it's just at subnational level where they first have to pay for their bills, operational expenses. So what gets to my grandma, maybe it's 2% or thereabout. But this is ideally using the traveling model, where you see that OECD, you can see how there's a stark difference. OECD, then the estimated national budget expenditure, and then the Makueni here. So you can imagine, even with the spike at 2020, with the COVID, this is how much got to subnational level. So I think this is, as alluded earlier on, we need tracking systems, we need financial innovations, because then we're getting into the age of debt as a financing instrument for climate adaptation. Direct access modalities to the multilateral climate funds, it's important because then, as you say, devolution, it's compact, it makes, that the units are stronger, but in my opinion, when you look at it from a fiscal perspective, unfortunately, the money is still controlled by the central government. So if they cannot access the financing, then I don't think you're really empowering the institutions that devolved, or the devolved setting.
Yeah.
Super.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent. Marie, next, thanks.
Turn off.
Yes, so we stay in Kenya looking at one of these projects and how it is marked by OECD, and then look at what does it mean in practice. So the FloCCA Dam is a mega dam in Makueni County, the county that Judith was also looking at. And we're looking at the construction of that and how it is funded and what actually then happens in practice. This is based on a paper that I'm co-writing with Eric Kioko and with Judith Mulwa. So, when you find this project, FloCCA Multipurpose Dam, in the OECD database, how it is marked as adaptation relevant, but it says it has a purpose of reducing vulnerability through local water supply. So that is adaptation on paper. Now, when you follow the funds, as Judith was also trying to do in her last graph, then you follow it through to the different stages towards implementations. So from the global to the local scale, then this mandate changes and what it says, it describes, the program, how it is described. In the African Development the Bank, it's categorized as sovereign infrastructure development. Going on into the national treasuries to the national level, it is presented as a flagship economic enabler under Vision 2030. I'll come back to Vision 2030. This is a national strategy and has a lot of these mega projects going on. I'll mention a few of them as well. And then local level, for this program, that doesn't really exist because, I mean, yes, it is in Makueni County, but this is certainly not locally led. So you have the county hosting the dam, but they have no mandates over the funds and they rely on the central level for implementation entirely. So then let's look at what is then FloCCA Dam in practice. Well, before the construction phase, you had cleanup of the two rivers, Athi River and Nairobi River, going into the construction zone. And you had cleanup of those rivers. Anybody who has been to Nairobi and been near Nairobi River would know that this is quite the job to do. So there is, I mean, to be fair, an adaptation function in cleaning up rivers. But that doesn't change the fact that this is a dam, which is mitigation at its core. Then let's look at the hydropower, because it is also this mega scale, as I was mentioning before. You have a capacity of 20 megawatts, that is the projected generation. But most of that is actually planned to go to Konza Technopolis. So let's look at Konza Technopolis. This is tech city that is being built south of Nairobi, roughly 2 hours away from FloCCA. So you're actually channeling away the electricity generated towards this a very, very impressive city. It looks like something coming out of Dubai, really, if you look at the grids, the water systems, electricity, completely green energy. There's supposed to be a university there. And it's, of course, also part of the Vision 2030 to attract green investment to the country, boost the Kenyan economy. So it's not only in terms of hydropower, it's also in terms of water supply that you have lines or arrows are pointing towards Konza from FloCCA. You have 60% of the water supply that is supposed to be channeled these 2 hours away and to Konza. The remaining 40% is then estimated to benefit the local communities. But if you look at that a little bit more closely, out of these 40%, you actually also have an irrigation project further downstream after the dam. The state is appropriating 1 million acres of agricultural land, and they need water for irrigation. That also comes out of the 40%. So whatever is left is a little bit unsure. This stage of the project has not been initiated yet, but it is certainly in the plans. But okay, so let's say some chunk of the 40% is left for the local communities. Yes, that would be adaptation. But we can also see now from being there and from interviews that you have examples where people have to pay for water. So that then questions the level of for the most vulnerable again. And I'll come back to the local level as well. because what we actually see, and this is my last slide, just to say, we have an adaptation project on paper, but what we see is that it is actually somehow molding, the labels are molding and becoming something else. So somehow a megadam turns into, it turns adaptation into mitigation, and in case of the local economy, the local communities, you also can talk about maladaptation. And we understand maladaptation as something that is not permanent. It's not a permanent stage. It can definitely evolve and turn into, solid adaptation for local communities, but that would demand that a different approach from the different institutions, and certainly from the state institutions, in supporting the relocation plans, resettlement, the compensation plans, the local economy that is collapsed, and also severe health concerns hitting the local community. So we're not really seeing those actions yet. So until we do that, what we are seeing on ground can be termed as maladaptation, a situation where people are worse off than before the construction started. We are also seeing a tendency in both this mega project, but also several others that are part of the Vision 2030, where vulnerable communities are portrayed not really as rights holders, but more as consumers of increasingly commodified resilience. So this is sort of a trend going also in others of these mega projects. So in contrast, so what kind of adaptation are we actually talking here? Well, we have adaptation on paper. Maybe we are actually talking adaptation for Kenya's economy as a boost of the Kenyan economy, a green branding exercise. But in that case, it is a very different understanding of what adaptation is than what we are usually used to thinking about adaptation, which would benefit the local communities. So rather, we are talking about a mitigation project here. But as Judith and Tallulah was also alluding to, mitigation is much more effective than adaptation in generating revenue that can go into loan repayments. And when we had the situations that we've heard this morning about Kenya being a middle-income economy, where you have to fund adaptation through loans, that then encourages, in this case, the Kenyan state to somehow make this mold and make this adaptation move from adaptation to mitigation. So in effect, we have a mega dam and Consa Technopolis supporting Kenya's green branding, adaptation for the Kenyan economy, and in order to attract more green investment and get more funds into the state economy. So this is actually an example of that. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you very much. The next we have Rogers on political will for adaptation in Tanzania.
Yes, I'm Peter Rogers. I'm from University of Dar es Salaam. And thank you, Tallulah, Marie, and Judith, that you have already laid the ground. Tanzania has been allocated 2.9 billion USD from 2014 to 2022. But the amount of finance that has been observed in the national budget is 1.2 billion, which you can see is almost is even less than the half of that finance. And that means the finance that goes to the ground is more or less than what even has been observed, received in the national budget. Then, as Tanzania advances to adapt from the impact of climate change, several policies continue to affect those efforts. And the key policy issues include lack of political will and the standalone climate change policy in the country. Tanzania has various sectoral related climate change policies, but in real sense it lacks the dedicated standalone climate change policy, and for this kind of fragmentation of these policies and strategies, we see there is weakness for the efforts toward the climate change adaptation, and this now leads to the international this climate change agenda to be run by the international mandates. And then policy issue number 2 that is facing Tanzania is the lack of this is a conflict of resources and authorities that we see. There are a lot of institutional contestations that every institutions want climate finance to be channeled through those institutions. For example, the vice president office is mandated to coordinate climate change, but also the prime minister office is also coordinates disaster management. When you close see this climate change and disaster management, you can just see this is just one thing, but is coordinated through different authorities. Now you can see how this thing is real. And again, at the Vice President office, which is the main coordinator, is helped by different committees such as the National Environmental Advisory Committee, National Climate Change Technical Committee, but all these committees, they are just not met. They don't meet at all, and if these committees don't meet, it means that there is a big problem on how this climate change issue is coordinated, because this committee are also mandated for vulnerability assessment. So it means for a long time the country is missing the updated vulnerability assessment. But also there is this overlapping of duties, because there is no climate change policy. These institutions, you can find same institutions is implementing different kind of projects, but those projects are also implemented in different kind in different institutions. Police issue number 3 is that climate change is contested with other development projects. For example, you can just see that climate change projects are sidelines in favor for other political rewarding projects. For example, these are schools and roads. One of the presenter has already said, I think Esbern said that most of the finance goes to payroll, to pay teachers and building roads, which also has been said by Eric. So this means that climate change adaptation in Tanzania is having much trouble with the development kind of initiatives. And we see, for example, when we do more analysis on the sectors, construction and education is among the top rated, or is among of the sectors that receives much of this finance. Now, this undermines the long adaptation investments, especially in the local level. And policy issue number 4 is that now most of these institutions that are mandated for climate change in Tanzania, they lack power. For example, the local government and the central government are connected, are linked through the president office, but in real sense, the president office has no power because climate change is linked at the regional administration division, which actually has no climate change department and has very few staff, and mostly foresters. And actually we see that climate change is not really favored at that office. And then to the local government, climate change is done done at the regional secretariat, but at the regional secretariat there is no climate change officer. The person who is mandated there is a regional environmental officer who is actually appointed. This person is not there on merit, but rather is just appointed. And there we see that climate change is not actually the priority. And that is the end.
Thank you very much, Rogers. We are now setting up Noah Makula to give his presentation from Tanzania. And the presentation will be on the ambiguity of climate change adaptation.
Hello?
Yes, no, we can see you, we can hear you clearly. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Eric. Good morning and good afternoon for those who are based in East Africa. My name's Noah Makula Pauline, and I will be sharing some insights from Tanzania with regards to the ambiguity of climate change adaptation and financing decisions in public budgets. And this is a draft manuscript which is to be submitted for publications soon. As Rogers and other presenters pointed, is that there is no clear definition as yet about climate change adaptation, particularly when it comes to climate financing. And this has led to multinationals and governments make decisions in their favor or based on their interests. Therefore, we present this Tanzanian case to show how the vagueness or the lack of a clear definition of climate change adaptation affects decisions in resource allocations. We know that over the decades, developed countries have been pledging and support and disbursing substantial finances for climate change adaptation. And however, the adequacy of these funds in addressing the needs of the developing countries remain a subject of debate, partly due to the ambiguous nature of climate change adaptation. This lack of a clear definition of adaptation has allowed, as I said, recipient countries' institutions to strategically interpret and tailor these funds to suit their institutional logics, thus creating a significant ambiguity that hinders effective action and influences resource allocation. So while scholars have noted the ambiguous nature of climate change adaptation, A few have explored this, how institutional logics shape the allocation of resources based for climate change adaptation and its implementation in recipient institutions. So this study addresses this gap by examining a real-world implication of the ambiguity in climate change adaptation, focusing on resource allocation within public institutions. And drawing on institutional logics theory and using Tanzania as a case study, the study investigates how competing organizational logics or interests or meanings among these institutions creates tensions, complicate funding decisions, and hinder cohesive adaptation efforts. By institutional logics, we mean the socially constructed patterns of symbols and material practices, assumptions, values, beliefs, and rules for which individuals and organizations produce and reproduce their material substances, organize time and space, and provide meaning to their social reality. That is according to Thornton and Ocasio. So this theoretical lens is particularly useful for examining how various public actors, each influenced by their distinct organizational logics, navigate ambiguity in climate change adaptation. So this study draws on three theoretical concepts to analyze the complexities of climate finance allocation, including contradictory institutional logics, resource maneuvering, and strategic ambiguity. So we use a lens of these three concepts to analyze the complexities of strategic ambiguity, of climate change adaptation ambiguity and resource allocation. So we interviewed 16 local government officials and 13 central government officials, and they were selected based on their roles in climate finance governance and adaptation planning. And the focus of the interviews was on climate change adaptation definitions and approaches, navigating ambiguity and conflicting logics, and policy interpretation and resource allocations. Coming to the findings, the contradictory institutional ambiguity in climate adaptation and governance, we found a policy gap and a leadership vacuum, where Tanzania lacks, as Roger said, a national climate change policy. We rely much on the National Climate Change Response Strategy of 2021, and which is also ending next year, 2026, which advocates for sectoral integration, but provides no clear lead institution. So, and the Vice President's office remains the de facto focal point, sidelining critical actors, for example, the Minister of Finance, despite his fiscal oversight role when it comes to finances. We also found central government struggles, where the Minister of Finance has established a climate change desk but lacks accreditation for climate finance due to bureaucratic hurdles. And of course, this climate change desk now is being established. They are trying now to establish a climate change unit within the ministry, which is charged by the mandates of resource mobilization and coordinating climate change finance within the ministry. Another struggle is on the sector ministries, for example, Minister of Water, Agriculture, Natural Resources, Livestock, Fisheries, etc., have environmental units with no budgetary authority, leading to poor coordination and climate adaptation being deprioritized within these ministries. A quote from one central government official says, each ministry has an environmental officer who reports to different bosses with competing priorities. On resource maneuvering, climate change adaptation funding, we found the dominance of donor funding, and this is due to strategic ambiguity also. 90% or more than 90% of climate finance comes from bilateral and multilateral donors, for example, GCF and others, with minimal domestic allocations, and where most of the domestic allocations are channeled to high revenue sectors, that is strategic prioritization we found during the study. So the local finances are channeled to high revenue sectors, for example, forest, tourism, clean energy, etc. And for example, a forest conservation aligns with carbon markets and tourism revenue. So that's where the local finances are channeled, and funds from multilateral and bilaterals are the ones which are labeled or channeled or tagged as climate adaptation finance. We also found budget transparency gap, where no climate-specific budget markers, until recently where we have an objective X. This is a budget line within the government budget or the public budget, and the Ministry of Finance's new tracking code. So they allocate finances in that budget line and invite ministries to apply or access that finances whenever they have climate change adaptation related projects. A quote from one central government says that we label projects climate change to attract donors. Our own funds aren't categorized this way. So that is shows how dominant donor funding are in climate adaptation action as compared to local finances. Strategic ambiguity in climate change adaptation governance. If I remind you about the definition of strategic ambiguity, which refers to the deliberate use of vague or flexible definition to navigate institutional constraints while advancing organizational interests. So key findings from Tanzania, we found no standardized definition of climate adaptation across government institutions, and this has been leading to inconsistent funding allocations and implementation approaches. And a good example is a Red Plus project conflict between the Minister of Finance and the Vice President's Office Division of Environment over resource control, where also we found the dual institutional logics at play. We have the Minister of Finance, which uses ambiguity to maintain fiscal control and budgeting flexibility, and the Vice President's Office, which is the focal point for climate change issues, leveraging ambiguity to assert political authority over climate governance. So this is the institutional logics in conflict between the Minister of Finance and the Vice President's Office. So the absence of standardized operational definition for climate adaptation has created a significant inconsistency in how projects are categorized and funded across government entities. This scenario illustrates how government entities use strategic ambiguity to secure resources and influence decision making. I have two cases to show the strategic ambiguity in practice.
In 1 minute,
the first one is the COSTECH. Thank you, Eric. Just concluding. One is the COSTECH transformer project, where it had the project on energy infrastructure upgrade to meet climate standards. COSTECH bypassed the Vice President's Office approval to accelerate implementation. And the consequence, the project was suspended when the VPO refused to retroactive endorse the project. When COSTECH was asked to report and attach an endorsement from the Vice President's Office, it faced challenges. Another is on the Red Plus implementation conflict that we had. We saw a resource. We found resource competition between the Minister of Finance and the Vice President's Office, both claiming oversight authority. So to conclude, due to the interest of time, some of the key findings are that climate adaptation is often used strategically to access international funds, reflecting ambiguities in climate finance governance, and clear definitions alone may not resolve deeper institutional logics driving resource competition, and adaptation funds often overlook local socioeconomic needs in favor of climate-centric agendas. So challenges in implementation for the Tanzanian case: institutional misalignment and competing priorities, hinder climate action, and bureaucratic constraints weaken execution despite recognition of urgency. We recommend aligning institutional structures and resource allocation, strengthening governance at all levels, and reconciling internal practices with climate demands. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. Nøhr Makula is the lead of the project at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Thanks a lot. I think you presented the entire paper to us and took a little bit of more time, but we appreciate that. The last presentation in this session is Christensen from the University of Copenhagen. Please, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Almost good afternoon, still good morning here in Denmark. And thank you for the invitation to present a few insights from local level issues when it comes to village and district level climate adaptation challenges and opportunities. I work at the IGN, the Department of Geoscience and Natural Resource Management at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm the PI of a research project kind of similar to GAP, rural-urban linkages for enhanced climate resilience in rural Tanzania. And just to show how closely we are linked, I can tell you that NOAA is also a part of our project. So we have a lot of things in common. I think we often say that where GAP follows the money, look how that flows from central level to local level. We look more broadly at different themes, but when it comes to administrative procedures, we look more on the policies. How are they formulated? How are they implemented? This diagram shows a bit of our overall interest in our project. We look at two different regions, Manyara and Singida region. In each region, we look at local level, different settings, different rural communities with a different distance to an urban setting to investigate rural-urban linkages and how they are affected by climate change and how they affect different choices, opportunities for climate adaptation. So it's this interaction at local level that we are comparing between two settings, these two regions. But there are also climatic differences between these regions. Manyara region, the Mbulu case where Noah was actually with us from right now, is a high rainfall area, 1,200 millimeter or more of annual rainfall, whereas the other Itigi and Singida region has 600 millimeters or less. So that's two very different settings, contexts, which with obvious impacts on vulnerability and resilience. Two different regions in Tanzania, where we've just heard about at the national level what type of policy setting, what type of gaps, what type of conflicts and coordination struggles we can observe. And we are also looking into some of these issues. So our two study regions, in each we selected an urban, a town. In Manyara region, it's Mbulu, and in Itigi, in Singida, it's Itigi. And then visited rural communities at different distances from these rural entities, these small towns, to see what are the links and what are the opportunities that the location gives them for changing livelihood strategies or getting access to other markets. The work package that I'm leading, work package 4, looks at policy, the policy cycle implementation, but all the way from formulation down to policy implementation at the local level. Many actors involved, many processes and many mechanisms. And we're inspired by two frameworks, theoretical frameworks. One, when we look at participation, level of participation and types of participation by rural communities. We look at the Einstein's ladder of participation, which you may know, an old framework back from '69 and has been applied in many different settings, from urban renewal and now to climate adaptation. So is a type of citizen participation, how real is it? Is it more or less tokenism? Is it even manipulation? Or is it, as far as expressed here, is it a type of citizen control where power and decision making is devoluted to the individual or to a group or community? So we use this framework when we look at the involvement of different rural communities and different groups within the communities due to the diversity we find in rural Tanzania. On the right, the framework we have been inspired by when we look at the policy cycle and the different actors and the relationship between them. It's called the multi-level governance framework, and it's was mainly been applied to study the links between EU policy directives and how these directives are applied and implemented in EU member countries. But it can be used at different levels. And as you can see, it shows different spatial levels, decision governance level, but also the different types of actors who are involved in policy formulation or implementation. With red, the public authorities, which are the key focus of our research, but also the other types of stakeholders, NGOs not least. What we find very interesting is to study the gaps between different actors, between different levels. Well, first of all, what are the linkages in terms of flows of finance, of information, of knowledge, of personnel, and what are the gaps then? We heard from previous speakers about misalignment of policies, of institutions, unclear division of responsibilities, and so on. So I find this framework very well suited to study those kind of things. For the presentation today, I would like to show some results from interviews at local level in the two study sites, interviews and focus group discussions with technical staff and politicians, district councillors in both areas, and also more formal or more one-to-one interviews, key informant interviews with local government administration, both at village and ward level. And the purpose was to study what happens at district level, local government levels, when directives or policies arrive at the desk, so to say. How are they coordinated? How are they prioritized? And how are they implemented? And we focused on this list. You can see the key elements that were part of our study. So which institutions, what type of framework at play, what were the mechanisms for coordination between institutions, if any, the policies in place, how well do they how well are they coordinated? Are there conflicts between them? We heard examples of that already. And what priority does climate change adaptation receive at district level? One strategy to choose is for mainstreaming, to say that all sector ministries and at all levels an attempt should be made to have a climate change adaptation be present in all policies. That's actually what's in the NCCRS in the strategy, but yes, I'll come back to that, what happens at the local level. Devolution resources, what is the capacity locally, and how well was the local community actually involved. And finally, implementation synergy. Yes, I will not have time. You gave me 2 minutes, okay. I'll take some of these main findings we have here. You can also find them in the slides afterwards. But let me go to from here and down, because I think actually the first two resonate very well with what the previous speakers have said on the national level. But policies, we find that at local level, it often becomes very general. It's often very general policy recommendations or directives that come from above. And there's very little opportunity to customize to local climatic conditions or even livelihood conditions. Mainstreaming as such is something that's being emphasized by the government of Tanzania, but we still see that the local administrative units, they act in silos. They're defending their own budgets, which are too small, and there's not a lot of proactive initiatives to coordinate or even to create synergy between activities that take place. So you only go outside your core mandate if there's funds, if there's money coming along for that. We find that not a lot of money has been devoluted to this level, as we heard before as well. In terms of capacity, we heard often that people are not aware. We found that people are not aware of the new policies, and there are many that are coming out. If there's knowledge of an existing climate change adaptation policy, it'll be an old one, not always what is now the new business on. And people often refer to as a traditional initiative, business as usual, such as tree planting. In terms of community participation, we find that indeed often people are guided by their local councillors to suggest fundable projects, those that have a chance to achieve funding, for example, school construction, and there's not a lot of flexibility for changing plans. It's a very long and tedious process, even if new priorities are coming up. That's kind of summarized up here. The recommendations that we would get are perhaps similar to what we heard for the national level, to increase opportunities, to give some space for synergy and local decision making, reduce bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, a lot of need to comply with different rules for transparency purposes probably, but it hinders local adaptation, local creation of local solutions, I think. And in terms of mainstreaming, you probably all know, or those of you know Tanzania, of the different high priority policy objectives called Objective A. It used to be HIV/AIDS initiatives. They are highlighted by many technical staff as being an example of something that could really, really penetrate and cut across different sectoral units. If climate change adaptation could be elevated to such levels, that might be maybe one solution also. And then to develop or adapt solutions to more local specific contexts also seems to be something that could gather more interest locally. I leave it there. But
thank you very much. Thanks a lot. To conclude the session, because we only have like 5 or so minutes for quick questions, but 10 minutes. But you've noticed a very interesting thing here, that at the global level, there's a lot of discussions and a lot of effort to release money, to increase the money. At the national level, there's always this kind of an issue. Some people are not happy. At the local level, where the adaptation is actually needed, it's a different story. I mean, that is really a paradox, and it's a really big question that we need to be thinking about, and especially the presentations, all of them sort of bring out this kind of an issue. So, very quick questions with quick answers to the presenters. I wish I had the time to recap what everyone has said, but for now, we do not have much time. What I noticed is that we started the project with the IED observation that only 10% of this money goes to the recipient countries actually goes to the local level. And Judith's work already shows that it's actually lesser than that. Perhaps what is going to her grandmother could be even 2%. So, questions? Thanks. I think we start from there.
Thank you. My name is it on? Okay. My name is Rolf Hörno. I'm a consultant. My question is actually maybe a broad one, so I don't know who should answer it, but even if, I mean, your presentations have highlighted all the challenges and barriers to locally led development at the county and district level in those two countries. Even if that succeeded, how local is that? To be a little bit provocative. I noticed the average size of a county in Kenya is about 1.5 million people. That would amount to a small country in my book. So is that really locally led development, even if that succeeded, to bring the finance to that level and make these democratic structures at that level actually manage the funds?
Yeah.
Have you considered that, or is that part of your discussions?
So that's a good question, and that also takes me back to the question I asked: what is really local? When we talk about local level, what is this local level? Anybody wants? Pierre?
Oh, can you respond to that?
Yeah.
I presented that table to provoke a little bit. Yeah. But I'm a bit in doubt about what is the solution. You can argue, okay, funds need to go down to the lowest level, but then you would fragment the money very substantially, and it will be very difficult to have meaningful projects implemented if you share them equally. So the solution is that you facilitate or you help the local government to identify where the most critical needs are, and then in those wards, there are a number of sub-entities, and you can have a more meaningful local engagement and more participatory planning at the lower level, like a ward and village level. But I think I have worked a lot. I've worked for some 30 years with local governments, and I think there's a lot of very often I meet NGOs and researchers. They talk about, we have to avoid political hijacking, stuff like that. But the whole idea of democracy is that you have elected politicians, and somehow you have to hold them, give them a role and hold them accountable. And I think that's part of what has been attempted when you allocate a bit of funds to the local governments. But at the moment, it's also a very small amount of money that actually reaches the local governments. And if you then argue that now we have to distribute it down to the village level, sharing it would be meaningless. And I'm afraid in Kenya at the moment there is a bill that's been debated in Parliament. I don't know if the ward allocation bill, which is actually making that argument, which would undermine the entire local government system. But that's another story.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. And I'm also interested, particularly at the global level, on what you are presenting. I hope somebody will ask about that. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Charlie, and I just had a question with respect to the innovative financing mechanisms in Kenya. And I work in climate finance and product development, and have for most of my career, but that hasn't been a super long time yet. And I've seen at least some evidence to say that these debt swaps, they look very innovative, and I think they are really great ideas in terms of the outcomes that they can generate. But I think there is some evidence to show that kind of in general, the general kind of capital markets, investors and such, see them actually as pseudo restructurings, not as defaults potentially, but pseudo restructurings, and so can actually lead to some level of toxicity with respect to new issuance and what what developing countries can, once they've gone through one of these debt swaps, what investors then look at how they look at the country afterwards in terms of their future issuance and what kind of financing terms they can arrange after that. And so, yeah, I wondered whether you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks, Judith.
You're very right. I didn't want to get into it because it's one of the things that the national government is looking at as an alternative. As also, so there's the swaps and there's the performance-based grants as innovations that are coming up because of the devolution and all that. But regarding the debt, you're very right. And I think what you said that, I mean, it's a safe space, Chatham House rules, but it might actually be the new colonialism if you look at it from a different perspective, because then you're literally getting into a country's budget, and the only way to control a country is through its fiscal structure. But I think that's another whole discussion as to the efficiencies of the swaps. What does it really mean? Because depending on what the debt swap is for. So for example, in the likes of Latin America, the debt swap is for, let's say, the forest cover or something along those lines. That means you're putting actually a productivity scale into that. But then in the case of Kenya, it's food security, so the outcomes of food security. So again, I think it depends on what the swap is for. If the swap is for matters, let's say, carbon, then that's a whole different trajectory. But food security outcomes, ideally, it's you setting up something that is linked to agriculture, which is, food and, that little bit. But debt swap, again, depending on what it is very highly contested.
Thanks. Any other question? We have a few minutes, but I needed to also ask a question here, particularly on your case. Do we see Africa coming up with its own model? Because, I mean, what has been proposed, you say that for World Bank, it took them a whole year to come up with this instrument, and yet they had to push some things there that were nasty just to tick the box. And we find that also having a challenge at the South. Can it then be, is it possible that Africa or the Global South comes with a non-mechanism, and perhaps whether that is possible even to think about?
Well, there is this performance-based grants model, which is really a capacity development at the same time, and that is really the same model for UNHCR, Capital Development Fund, and the World Bank. I haven't seen much African models coming out, or Global South models. In fact, I think it's about time not just to focus on those $100 billion of money and money, because money is not going to solve this problem. We need to start thinking about governance, and it's clearly that the FloCCA type of program is just one model. But we need a lot more discussions on how one could make maybe alternative models instead of just talking about getting access to the funding. And I think this whole discussions in the morning and here has shown that there's a lot more need to talk about governance and institutional reform in the South. And making democracy work, as Per says.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And there's also a lot of activism at the negotiation tables. I look forward to seeing the same kind of activism and wars in the South that push governments and local institutions to be able actually to deliver the adaptation. We have a question?
Is there time?
Yes, I mean, we can never say no to
It's mean when I'm holding you from lunch, but sorry. Thank you for some very interesting presentation. My name is Lærke. I come from a green think tank in Denmark called Concito. I just wanted to ask, because now it seems like there's a lot of focus and international interest in country platforms. And I've also thought about how does that actually work in terms of also bringing these thoughts on mainstreaming and integration across government institutions into at the local level. I don't know if that's some thoughts you are also looking into. That would be really interesting to hear.
Who wants to? Yeah, perhaps.
Whether Henning, you can say something on that. To what extent?
I'm not sure I can say much more than Lærke already knows, but just to say that as I also mentioned this morning, the country platform notion is something that is in the international discussions at the moment, and Lærke also knows that. And I think the idea is, in fact, this building these national systems that not just look on local level, but also on national level, and especially the relation between those two. And some of the programs we've been discussing, they are creating climate capacity within Minister of Finance or Minister of Planning. They are trying to have this whole of government coordination improved, which I think one said it's non-existing, for example, in Tanzania at the moment. So trying to build that kind of platforms that can also work on, as we also mentioned this morning, on to get the climate financing that is not already on budget, get that on budget, so it can be a part of the national prioritization of funding for climate adaptation, and especially building this capacity nationally to deal with it local level. And I fully agree with what Esbern is saying. This is all about governance. But I think we have to think around these systems also for the sake of sustainability, because what we see is that some of these investments we do may work for the short time we are around with funding, but we have to put it on national funding because that's going to be the long-term stream of support for local communities.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think
if I may just add, and when we talk about national platforms, I think it's not just, it's also about politics, because we I can understand in Kenya we had they can link very much up with a FloCCA program with devolved decision making. But in Tanzania, the last 25 years has all been about centralizing power in Dodoma, and I'm yet to understand to what extent a similar scale program can work in Tanzania, where or can be accepted by politically in Tanzania, where all decision making is centralized. What kind of new institutions are? And does this really have the political support from government, other than saying thank you for the money? But do they actually think in terms of changing their own institutional structures?
We will see what they have built into the scale program as it designed now. Yeah. Taken up an either loan of $100 million the government.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think to conclude then, I'm an anthropologist, so I always talk about the people. I'm a smallholder myself, and I always think about if I lose crops for 2 consecutive seasons, at least I can afford food from the small salaries I get. But what about the vulnerable people? So when we are discussing about climate change and adaptation and all this global north-south kind of division that has existed, let us not also be entangled with pushing democratic structures at the expense of the people that actually need adaptation. Because I think the discussion has remained at the national fights, the international activism and fights, and at the local level, then there is also the continuous need. And that's where I draw the line as an anthropologist. We need to think about the grandmother and me as a smallholder.
And after lunch, we are going to go into the locally led adaptation model and some experiences. So stay after lunch. We will have a quick sandwich now. Thanks a lot. Again. This third session will be on governance of locally led adaptation. And we have three speakers. First, we will have Philip Akello who's working with a FloCCA program from the Danish Embassy in in Nairobi. We will have Dr. Omala from Kenyatta University, who's been a PhD student with our program, who will look at climate change vulnerability as it determined for subnational level climate finance. And we will have online from Tanzania, Beatrice Sumari, talking about the political economy at the local government level with a case study from Miro. We have been talking about these different models from locally led adaptation. We've been talking about the FloCCA program. So I will give the words to Philip to talk about the implementation challenges and the governance at subnational level in East Africa.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Okay, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. So I'm Philip Akello, program manager here within our climate and environment team at the Danish Embassy in Nairobi. So I'm the the focal point for FloCCA. So maybe I'll just quickly run through this. I hope you can see the next slide. Right. So quickly, I'll just share about a brief background on the FloCCA
Philip,
program.
could you put on your video so we can see you?
Oh, thank you. Just a minute. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
See me.
Excellent.
Oh, thank you. So quickly, a brief background. We look at the two funding streams. Then on some progress to date. But also just to say that late last year there was some midterm review. So just again, just highlighting on how it is progressing and some key findings and recommendations. Finally, also equally important is a bit of collaboration with Danida Fellowship Center, for the FloCCA program. I think that also will be a very important just to share. So quickly, FloCCA is, of course, financing locally led climate action program. It is a World Bank led program with the several development partners started around 2021. So Denmark, we came in, we have Sweden, and then we have soon been joined by others, and of course also the Kenya government. And the program development objective is to deliver locally led climate resilience actions and strengthen both the subnational or county and the national government's capacity to manage climate risk, through climate finance, basically flowing at both levels of government. So let me say quickly that FloCCA supports GOK's government of Kenya to operationalize its ambitious climate agenda. And it is people-centered, as we say, community or locally led, meaning it creates a community platform for decision-making, of course supports the devolution and deepens community participation and citizen engagement. All the way up to the villages, it is a platform also where communities prioritize their climate agenda, but we also encourage local knowledge, partnering with the climate science. Let me also say it's also a platform for climate action and mobilization of climate finance. We see this as one program that can bring different financing mechanisms together to support climate action and also attract additional climate finance. But also an aspect of capacity building where it addresses gaps in institutional capacity and coordination, both horizontal and vertical. Something that is very key is that FloCCA is operationalized through a set of very key county performance areas through the grants that I will share after this slide, through what we call the minimum access conditions. Of course, when FloCCA came on board, counties were very excited. There's money that is coming. It is a nationwide program, which is also in itself very unique. Through the World Bank, is the first of its kind globally, where you have got a nationwide climate action or climate adaptation program. So there are these minimum access conditions that are also incentives in some way to enable the counties or the subnational governments to receive, climate funding. One is that the counties are expected to enact relevant policies and legislations that will then enable climate finance flows. I think that is key. Again, in Kenya, we have, of course, you have the National Climate Change Action Plan, which by law required counties, to develop their own action plans. So before FloCCA came on board, I think it was just about 5 counties that had taken this serious. So FloCCA then became an incentive to also for counties to adhere to, some of the constitutional requirements and the laws around Climate Change Act. So one, the counties have to develop their own specific climate legislation, and it is important to realize that the national one may not work. Different counties have faced different climatic risks. Kenya in itself is many countries in one. Geographically speaking, we have the islands, we have the lake basin, the coastal region, the savanna grassland, the desert, northeastern part. So it therefore means different counties are impacted differently. Hence the need for a county-tailored law legislation, very important. 2, also they are to establish mechanisms to engage communities in risk assessment and resilience planning. 3, to have a dedicated county climate change unit, and of course climate change fund. So they set aside a special purpose account for that. The CECM is a county executive committee member, so they are also required to have like a minister in charge of climate action at the county level. Number 4, of course, is to prepare participatory climate action plans that are then funded through the program. They're also to mainstream climate action and resilience building in county planning and budgeting. As I say that every county receive their own development budget from the exchequer, so a bit of mainstreaming throughout the sectors was required. And of course, increase county investment budgets that promote social resilience outcomes. Quickly into the funded activities, we have 2 funding streams. And let me say that the county allocations should form about 87% of total FloCCA funds, so that the only 13, remains from the national government level, basically. So the 2 funds of the county climate institutional support, which assist in putting institutional arrangements for county climate action in place, have the offices in place, support the legislation work, support all the institutional arrangements that are necessary for the flow of funds. And the second level of grants is then what we call the county climate resilience investment grants, which goes to support the actual climate projects. So as you can see the figures there, it was just around 100,000 USD per county for 3 years. So, for every year for 3 years. So then the initial plan is to have around 300,000 USD per county for institutional support, and at least 1.25 million USD per year, again, for projects. That's the minimum. Let me add at this point, FloCCA is performance-based, meaning that, of course, depending on the performance metrics, if you do better as a county, you get more, the following year, and so on and so forth. Funding is around 3 key sectors: water, agriculture, and environment. Of course, you also have cross-cutting Some of those include energy, so you can have energy, you can have circular economy around waste management and so on and so forth. Now, where we are now is we have 47 counties, but in terms of the resilience grants where projects are done, the target is 45 counties that of course have rural areas and so on. So Nairobi and Mombasa, which are more urbanized counties, are excluded in terms of the resilience grants, but they also participate in the institutional grant. So just to say, 45 counties complied, which excludes Nairobi and then Mombasa. Currently, we have an ongoing implementation of climate action plans. So already counties went through participatory climate risk assessment, developed climate change action plans, and received the first resilience grant last year. So we have an ongoing implementation. Let me also say that, you know, apart from Denmark and Sweden that were regional development partners with the World Bank, we now have on board the Netherlands, we have Germany through KfW, the Nordic Development Fund, and so on. At the moment, also several countries have requested the World Bank to replicate the FloCCA model and are also benchmarking with Kenya. I've given an example there. We have Sierra Leone, of course, Tanzania also, through what they're calling the scale. We have Bangladesh. And let me say for Tanzania and Bangladesh, Denmark is also supporting those two countries. And then also just to say there's a level of county ownership. Of course, it was a minimum access condition and counties are doing well. At least 1.5% of the development budget they were asked, you know, to put towards climate action. There are counties that have gone as much as 4%, which is encouraging. We have also a bit of the DFC technical capacity work that is ongoing. I'll share that as I finish. And then we've had a midterm review that, you know, I will also share that, also just showing it is on track, remains highly relevant to Kenya's development goals. So these were some of the quick findings in terms of the overall risk. It is rated as moderate due to effective participatory planning process and strong county commitment. And that counties are also, you know, putting in some money, around 3 billion Kenya shillings. There's maybe around, not sure, maybe 160 million DKK thereabout initial contribution. So as we talk now, we have around 2,245 ongoing sub-projects in the 45 counties. You realize water takes the largest share for obvious reasons. The major climate risk in Kenya is either too much water or none of it. Environment, in terms of environmental protection, protecting degraded landscapes and so on, 28%, then agriculture, 13%. Others like energy coming in at 8%. Like I've said, FloCCA serves as a central platform, one of the findings, for coordinating and mobilizing climate finance at both levels of government. Just to see the figures there from KfW, 31 million euros. We have an additional 10 million that has come on board, each from Netherlands and Nordic Development Fund. So FloCCA has really served as that platform where most of the development partners feel it's one-stop shop for climate funding because it is a nationwide sort of a program, and there are very good institutional arrangements and setups for climate funding. But the finding also found out there is more need for technical support, and counties also have their own experiences, issues around political interference. It is expected. There's a politics behind it where the political class wants to influence where programs go and which specific programs are to be implemented, as much as it is locally led. Delays in budget approvals, technical capacity gaps, conflict over resource management, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of collaboration with DFC, this is what we discovered. This is at Denmark. There was really an oversight in program planning. So in terms of capacity, there was emphasis on institutional, which is good. Of course, setting up the units and so on, the frameworks, M&D. However, it overlooked the technical capacity on climate. What has happened in Kenya over the years is the climate discourse has taken place more at the national level and not at the county level where now, climate action is taking place. So we have the units in place, but in terms of technical capacity, in terms of the quality of the climate action that are coming from the ground, there was a gap in addressing that so that we avoid the business as usual scenario. If you look at the current action plans, most of them is the business as usual, dig a borehole here, desilt a dam over there, plant trees over here. They are not really some of them are not really inspiring in terms of being very transformational in addressing the climate risks in a sustainable manner. And that is where we felt we needed to address that. So we allocate additional funding from the embassy here just to work now with the government to address the technical gaps. And let me say, we carried out a technical needs assessment with the Danida Fellowship Center through the counties. The counties themselves express the need. So let me say it is also demand driven, and they're able to say, where the gaps are lying. So one, we are of course addressing that technical gaps. But two, we are interested in improving the climate action plans quality, so that there are quality action plans that then are very transformational in nature. Through that also, we are enhancing collaboration, inter-county collaboration, because you realize we have what we call economic blocks, county economic blocks. So different counties are share the same geographic and climate risks are grouped together, and they are able to have their own collaboration and even have climate change action plans that address transboundary issues. So we are seeing that is happening, and through DFC we are addressing that. And finally, also opportunities therefore for fundraising beyond FloCCA. FloCCA funding is not enough. What the counties are setting up is not enough. Could there be opportunities for counties to collaborate, even do a green climate fund, sort of fundraising and so on and so forth. So this is what I just wanted to share briefly. That's where we are, and also perhaps what we are doing as Denmark to enhance the FloCCA program. In the interest of time, allow me to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much appreciated. Okay, for now we will go on to the next speakers, and then we'll return for a panel discussion in the end. So can I call Millicent to talk about, does climate change vulnerability determine subnational level climate finance allocation? And the word is yours, Dr. Omala.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm trying to adjust this mic. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good afternoon. My presentation is on climate vulnerability, climate change vulnerability. And most of the time when we're talking about, I should pull it, okay. Thank you. Most of the time when you're talking about climate change adaptation and climate financing, we also mention climate change vulnerability. But does it really count when it comes to climate finance allocations? That's the question I am asking today. We have defined climate change vulnerability. Somehow we have an idea of who is vulnerable, but the question that remains unanswered is whether or not climate finance is targeted at the most vulnerable, for the most vulnerable populations. And this question remains unanswered from global to the subnational levels as well. So the intention of the Paris Agreement, for example, was to target the most vulnerable countries that have substantial capacity constraints as well. But when it comes to financing, and especially the funds-based mechanisms, we see that these recipient countries are expected to compete for the funding. And the assumption is that the countries in most need and those with the best adaptation concept then gets to benefit. But it doesn't work that way, because in most cases, the most vulnerable countries are also not the ones with the strongest institutional capacities to be able to attract the funding. So they are left out. And then the question is, have these funds then been flowing to developing countries that are most vulnerable, or those with the strongest institutional capacities? An assessment has been done, some studies analyzing the various funds, and really other factors are stronger in explaining these resource allocations apart from, rather than vulnerability. But let's look at the Kenyan context. Kenya is one of those countries that have made effort to establish the required climate change legal and institutional framework, and it has been able to attract quite some significant funding in terms of climate finance. So in Kenya, I looked at the OECD data between 2013 and 2021 for all climate-related projects, adaptation, mitigation, and the cross-cutting. My focus has been in Turkana County. Turkana is a very dry, arid county, and also has been cited repeatedly as one of the highest counties with the highest climate change vulnerability. So I wanted to find out how much of these, or how many of these projects have gone to Turkana, really being a vulnerable county. And only 19 out of the 541 projects had been allocated in Turkana. And so I went to look at the 19 projects. What was the targeting criteria? Why was Turkana selected? Was it based on the vulnerabilities that are there? First of all, none of the 19 projects originated from Turkana. All the conceptualization, design, planning has been either at the national level or at the IGAD level. So it wasn't really coming from people, from the bottom up, I would say. And then when it comes to targeting criteria, why Turkana was selected, 5 out of the 19 were countrywide projects. So it wasn't specific for Turkana. And then the 12 are drought-related projects that are mainly designed around the ending drought emergency strategy that was designed following the severe drought that affected many countries in the Horn of Africa in 2011, and that they had a summit in Nairobi that ended up in developing this strategy. So most of the projects have been designed around that strategy. Then we have the locust invasion project. Many countries were affected, especially in the ASAL regions, and they were targeted. Turkana benefited. Then the wind power project is the last one, but I focused on the adaptation projects, then went deeper to analyze, well, these 18 projects have come to Turkana. How is the targeting done at the sub-county level, the ward level, community level? How are these specific locations selected? Also following the issue of vulnerability. When I went there, out of the 18 projects, 2 did not exist in the records. Even in the institutions that had been listed to have implemented the projects, they didn't have records. So I looked at the 16. And the criteria number 1 that was followed, they were looking for places with potential for permanent irrigation. And that explains why most of the projects are then distributed around the Turkwel River in the sub-counties that are around there, the Loima and Turkana South sub-counties. And then the other criteria was that they needed value chains that had potential for commercialization. So targeting groups that were already engaged in value chains that have potential for commercialization, and so they were given money to enhance or improve on expand their project activities. Then we have emergency response, like the locust invasion, and also cash-based transfers when drought is declared an emergency. There is 13% that looked at vulnerability. I'll get into that in a minute. But just to say that the same way we have seen at the global level, where the most vulnerable countries are not the ones who have that institutional capacity to attract funding, even at the community level, the most vulnerable populations are not the ones who have that group level institutional capacity to start engaging in value chains that have potential for commercialization to be able to attract this funding. And so they are left out. There's a consistent pattern where the most vulnerable are being left out from the global to the community level. That's what I observed. But then we have a few that looked at vulnerability, actually mentioned vulnerability and vulnerability assessments and community consultations. I'm glad Philip just talked about FloCCA, and it's one of those that have looked at vulnerability and made attempts to, made it a requirement actually for all the counties to conduct climate change, vulnerability and risk assessments. The question is, are they meaningful? Once we have done the vulnerability assessments and community consultations, do they count when it comes to resource allocation? What I have seen is that most of the time, decisions are really not largely informed by the assessments that have been done or the consultations that we do. At the end of the day, it's the donor preferences, is all of these factors that I mentioned in the previous slide that inform. So FloCCA, for example, required that to be done, and counties did vulnerability assessments and then developed ward-level climate change action plans that were then consolidated to the county level. So we have county-level action plans that are supposed to ideally guide the prioritization of these projects, but it doesn't happen that way most of the time because they have already specified the sectors, as Philip mentioned, that all the projects have to fit in. So in Turkana, for example, 90% of communities' needs are around water, but there's no way they can put all the projects under water because then it's performance-based. If they do that, then it lowers their score in the subsequent assessments and reduces their chances of the amounts that they get in terms of funding. Even though the vulnerability assessments had been done, Turkana got the highest allocation, not because of the vulnerability in the county, but because of all the things they put in place. What Philip was mentioning, they went out of their way to establish a new office for climate change. They put in the laws that were required. So all of this was being assessed, and that's why they got the highest allocation. But really, it should have been informed by vulnerability. So in the end, what we have are adaptation options that have not been shaped by people's needs, but they are really externally shaped. So we have finance allocations shaping those adaptation options. We have projects that are being introduced to communities that don't really necessarily fit into their socio-cultural context and also do not address their immediate needs. So in the end, we talk about projects failed because there was no ownership, but we miss out on having these consultations or vulnerability assessments mean something, count for something when it comes to resource allocation and conceptualization of these projects. Yeah, I was looking for an image that depicts this, how these projects are introduced, and it's just someone telling them something that has already been decided elsewhere, already at the national level or at the county level, and we can see everyone is shocked, like, is this what we really asked for? How does this help us in the immediate need? How do you so address without taking the measurements of the person who is going to wear it? Is one of the question one of the stakeholders asked me when I was doing my studies in Turkana. These are some of the value chain projects that I visited. And just to conclude, that these findings align with earlier studies that indicate vulnerability really doesn't determine allocation of climate finance to a large extent. We have seen it from the global to the village level. The most vulnerable are not really the ones that are prioritized when it comes to climate finance allocation. I'm working on that publication on vulnerabilities, but there are previous ones that I have done on climate finance coordination, power relations from a global perspective, and also coordination based on the Kenyan case. We have all of them online, including a policy brief. If you can't find them, please reach out to me on this email. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Millicent. And then we will get the final talk by Beatrice Sumari from Dar es Salaam on a video link, and she's looking at the power relationship between village government and district technical staff and district politicians, and then a localized representative from central government. Beatrice, the word is yours. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Beatrice Sumari, and I'm calling in from Dar es Salaam. And before I start my presentation, I would like to comment on the other previous researchers for actually laying the foundation of this presentation, made my presentation become so simple. So kindly allow me to use few minutes to talk to you about the political economy of locally led adaptation from Odhiambo village.
Sure.
So why did we choose Odhiambo as the case for this matter? Odhiambo is a village prone to serious flooding and erosion due to its location between surrounding hills. This village is located in Meru District Council, Arusha region in northern Tanzania. In this area, I mean Meru District, we found that the central government has been implementing climate change adaptation projects in a top-down manner, meaning these projects are implemented without adequately involving the community. But when we looked at these projects, we found that most of them failed due to poor relevance and the lack of community ownership. So this case of Odhiambo stands out as a successful example of locally led adaptation because it's driven by community priorities and is implemented using funds from the Social Action Fund. This case is used to explore how agency, power, and structure interact in the implementation of adaptation projects. Now let's look at how this project was implemented, its origins, and the planning. This contour project in Odhiambo began in response to devastating floods back in 2012 and 2013. Actually, we found out before this project was implemented in this village, there was another project which was the same contour project, which was also donor funded. But when the previous project phases out, the community stopped to take care of the contours, so the village was prone to flooding again. When the villagers realized the importance of contours, then through the government planning tool, which is O&OD, they prioritized contour digging again as a solution to recurring soil erosion and flood damage. What made this project different was how it was planned. It wasn't imposed by the central government, but it was proposed by the community. These villagers accessed 75 million Tanzanian shillings from Tanzanian Social Action Public Works Program, which allowed them to hire local labor and fund the project directly. So when we look at this project from a political economy perspective, it is significant. Tanzania's social action funding through a part of national program provided a rare window of devolved decision making and flexible resource use, but it also enabled in part by external donor requirement, which is the World Bank. This allowed local agencies to emerge within normal centralized system. What are the outcomes of this locally led agency in action? The impacts of this project were substantial. The villagers reporting reduced flooding, restored soil fertility, increased crop yield, and also passable roads, just to mention a few benefits. What's more impressive is how the project fostered local ownership and sustainability. Community members created by laws requiring planting of trees and grasses along contours, something they initiated by themselves. The case shows when agency is enabled, that is when people can define their problems and implement their own solutions, actually adaptation works. Unlike the top-down projects where people didn't even know where the funding came from, here the community was involved at every stage of the project planning to execution and monitoring as well. It is a practical illustration of how structure sometimes enables urgency. Now let's look at the political dynamics of this project. The success suggests that key structural limitations, although this project was a success, but it shows there are also structural limitations in locally led adaptation. Although while Odonyongiro acted, its neighboring village, which is Mareo village, located upstream, where most of the flooding came from, did not prioritize the same project, despite it being convinced by Odonyongiro to prioritize contour projects. This decision left Odonyongiro vulnerable to continued flooding from Mareo runoff. But what is interesting here is that the district council, when these things were happening, the district council delayed releasing Mareo project funds in attempt to encourage coordination. This shows how political and institutional structures shape outcomes. The agency of the village level is still embedded within broader structural dynamics. The lesson here is that successful local adaptation also requires a cross-village coordination, and the political economy of who controls planning funds and the timing also affects outcomes. Now let's look at what are the lessons we learned from this Odonyongiro village. This is my last slide, and I'll conclude by saying that Odonyongiro shows us that locally led adaptation delivers real results, especially when communities control planning and have access to flexible funds. They design better, more sustainable solutions. However, this success was not just about local effort, it was also about the enabling institutional environment which was provided by TASAP and donor-backed flexibility. The political economy of climate adaptation in Tanzania is still largely favors centralized control, but this case of Odonyongiro provides that shared power, local agency, and tailored planning are crucial for sustainable adaptation. Ultimately, if we want adaptation to work, we must rethink who decides, who acts, and actually who benefits. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Beatrice. We have a few minutes in end here. Is there any questions or comments to these three presentations? Now's the time. Per?
Yes, I have a question to the presentation from Dr. Millicent. Because you were talking about a number of old interventions that were registered in the OECD database back from 2013 up to, I think,
2021.
And then you were also talking about FloCCA. And that was, to me, there was a little bit of, it was not clear to me whether it seemed to me you had a critique of whether the FloCCA planning mechanism was making a difference or not, or maybe I misunderstood. I think what I'm interested to understand is whether the FloCCA program is making a difference or not, because clearly most of the projects that were in the OECD database that were implemented in the county were not locally planned, that's for sure. And you demonstrate also the problems about that. And then my question is, did FloCCA then make a change or not? Because you were posing some critique, but you were, I don't know if I understood you correctly, if you were doing fieldwork in 22, 23? Because that's before FloCCA actually starts implementing.
Yeah.
So just want to be clear.
Thanks. Is it on? Yeah, you can hear me. Thanks, Bea. Yeah, it's interesting question. Thanks for asking. So the field, I looked at the projects that had been implemented 2013, 2021, but at the time of that study, FloCCA had not been rolled out yet. The structures had been established, yes, but the money had not started flowing. And so I went back this year in April to just see, because there was a lot of hope when it was promised to be locally led, and all this vulnerability, and actually they were called participatory vulnerability and risk assessments. They were done, and the climate change action plans were developed at the ward level. Turkana has 30 wards, and so they were consolidated to form the climate change action plan at the county level. And so the hope for the communities was that what they gave in terms of input during when these documents were being developed was what was going to guide the allocation of funds. But when the FloCCA funding arrived in the county, it appears that there are other donor preferences that have to be adhered to, because as we heard, is performance-based. And so there's these assessments that are done. To what extent have you adhered to those conditions before, and that informs the subsequent funding. So the Climate Change Directorate at the county level is kind of held with these conditionalities in a way that although the communities told them that we need water, 90% of them say they need water, but they can't put all of these projects underwater, because then that assessment, it will lower their score. So they're trying to fit into what has already been specified, and in the process, they're introducing projects just to balance those sectors, but not necessarily what the communities requested for. And that is that's the biggest challenge that is actually happening, but it's making a difference. Only that is to the extent that it's locally led is still unclear.
Okay, was that a good answer, Per?
Because it's a new program that is to address these challenges.
And I think it's a program which has a built-in learning curve. I mean that there's a dialogue between the county and the project every year.
Understand exactly what are the preconditions, or the whole basic idea is supposed that it's not earmarked a sector compared to any other fund. Now you're telling me it is earmarked.
Yeah, they have specified and agriculture.
Yeah. And I think for Turkana, pastoralism is missing in the whole. That is only addressing the communities along that. Pastoralism is the economic base.
Yeah.
This kind of overcame.
Because, thanks, Eric. And when communities are asking, can we restock? They are told, no, this is not part of it. And for them, that's like an urgent need.
That's also new to me, and then that may be linked to the board of the bank wanting to set kind of criteria for broad criteria for what the money should be used for before the bank board said yes. But of course, that is undermining the whole idea. That is true. Is there any questions for the FloCCA presentation from the embassy or for Beatrice?
I'd be interested to hear Philip's reaction also to Millicent's presentation and see whether that fits what he's seen also.
Yeah. Is it possible to ask Philip a question? Yeah.
Yes, I have a question for Philip. Philip, if you are there.
Go ahead, I'm here.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you heard or were able to listen to Millicent's presentation, and because I mean that is more maybe a different part of the FloCCA program. So I was wondering what was your reaction to that, and whether that fits. I mean, Millicent's concerns, whether that fits with what you have found as well.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Millicent. yeah, to the extent that, of course, there are those conditionalities where, counties are supposed to, adhere by in terms of meeting all the conditions, how much project should be on water, how much on, now let me say it is not so much as projects, but in terms of funds allocation. Okay, that if you get this funding, this percentage, should go to agriculture, this percentage to environment, this percentage to water, and the rest others. It is more of funds allocation. Of course, then that might limit if your priority is water. You look at the money you have, then it means you have to balance. So it is more on funds allocation. But let me agree that that is a hindrance, and of course we are assessing. It is still early days, and I remember one of the discussions we had during a recent World Bank mission, just to review progress, is counties are challenging that. I think us as the development partners, we are also challenging that. Remember, like I said, Kenya is many countries in one. So you can't have uniformity, in terms of how projects should be implemented and how counties can prioritize. If you go northeastern, for sure, over 90% will be water, because that is the greatest need. If you go to the highlands, it's a mixture of water and agriculture, and maybe environment and so on and so forth, coming in strongly. So we are encouraging the bank to look into and be a little more flexible in terms of looking at those differences, so that then it is truly locally led. Finally, let me finish, and that is the work now we are doing with the Danida Fellowship Center, is counties can beat this. When you have an integrated program where it is a water program, but it is addressing, you are starting first of all with water catchment protection, can be considered environmental, because you need that. So you need to protect the water catchment. And then, you are able to build dams and so on, to collect this water. And then you're able to use that water for agricultural activities or any other activities, for livestock, for domestic, and so on. So there is that whole, sort of a value chain approach to programming. Because the challenge the counties have had is having this single project, dig a borehole and it's a project, and so on and so forth. Then we are encouraging counties to look at a value chain approach. It can be a water project, but it is addressing livelihoods and so many other things. Then it's difficult to challenge that if the counties are able to present, this is our project, and so on and so forth. So it is still early days, lots of lessons being learned. And I think the bank is flexible moving forward. Let's see how it goes. But I think, we expect some flexibility and changes moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Did that satisfy you, Millicent?
Yes.
Yes. Satisfied researcher, fantastic. Is there any other comments? Else I will wrap it up. Yes, please, Judith.
Very surprising, because if we look at it from the context of Makueni, it's the opposite. So maybe it's not a full figure of what's happening under FloCCA in the different counties. But in the case of Makueni, actually prioritization when it came to water, they have so far financed only water projects, and this is in the context of the sand dams. So, for example, within the 30 wards, I think so far they financed only 10 for the first batch, which was under the ADA consortium, which was the inception of the FloCCA. But when FloCCA came, they didn't move to the second priority, which was agriculture. They continued financing still on water. So I think maybe it's a preference issue when it comes to the counties. because in the context of Makueni, the first vulnerability was water, as you're saying, because Makueni is very dry, but there was never a second. Agriculture was the second, but they have not yet. They still continue to finance the first priority until they meet the needs of all the counties that are underwater, because it was number one. So now what they have done, because that is on budget, back to my financing, Eric, sorry. But the second part, which is what they have done when it comes to matters agriculture, the coordination, they have made sure that all the NGOs that are coming into Makueni, instead of financing sundams, because sundams is a it has to be within the mandate of the county government, they ask now the off-budget guys to finance agriculture, because it's the second priority. So I think it's also a matter of coordination. So when they're reporting, I think I have seen their performance, because now the counties have been asked to do a performance. They are addressing both, but they show that there's an added value where other financiers are coming to finance other vulnerabilities. But our core is water when it comes to matters FloCCA.
How are these also on that? A quick reaction on that is that for Makueni, sundams are not new. They have been funded. They have been most of them. I think a good number of them have been installed before FloCCA. Exactly. So I think supporting water projects or sand dams, particularly after FloCCA, then it's like an addition. It's like they find a good basis to expand the water projects, while in the actual sense they have a history in the area. So I do not know whether here we can then say about prioritization of water, when in the actual sense this was already a priority for the county even before FloCCA. You get the point?
No, because the PVCA that was done by ADA is the same PVCA that was used when FloCCA came. The Participatory Climate Vulnerability Assessment. So remember, in FloCCA, there's the mature counties and the new counties. So the mature counties already had a PVCA before even FloCCA came. So prioritization had already been done in the counties even before.
Okay, thank you very much. I will say a few words to end the conference. I've personally been very satisfied with how the day has gone. It's beyond my expectations. We really came around a whole range of topics relating to the GAP program. I mean, we had a morning where we were provided with a lot of figures that were not always coherent with each other, maybe, but we will catch up on that. But we had Hans Peter coming with key figures and points from the global adaptation finance. We had Tallulah providing the most accurate data which we have up to date from the OECD database, and elaborating on the real value of this funding. And Per reported from the group of GAP researchers who've been working with the flow of funds, and touched upon this institutional capacity to implement climate change at the local county level. Which I think we also need to further develop. That's an interesting concept. I think Henning from the ministry also provided us with a lot of insights on their thinking, and also raised a couple of dilemmas and really asked us from the research community, what is adaptation? So the ambiguities certainly also, or disagreement within the ministry is quite open to is it only locally led adaptation which is adaptation, or does it include all these other things which are included in the Rio markers? Is it adaptation? Is it some assistance which can qualify as adaptation, or is adaptation which is satisfying locally demands, which might be two very different issues. I talked a bit about the evolution of donor thinking and donor support for adaptation, and in the end we had John Nøhr coming with his quite disturbing thoughts. I mean that there's really a lot of disagreement from the global south in the level of funding. So there's a huge discrepancy between the north and the south in this, but that's an ongoing discussion. But I realized that really the type of discussions happening in the COP is very, very far away from what's going on the ground. So maybe there's a need to reconcile these different levels of discussions. I think also the second, we had some excellent cases in the second round. I mean, we had the Judith talking about the financial composition in Kenya and the fact that it's loans and Kenya is a middle income country, which is perhaps among the countries in the world of taking most loans and being indebted, and of course that is creating huge instability for the economy in the future. There was this fascinating study of Maria and Erik and Judith on how an adaptation intervention can end up as a mitigation or even maladaptation intervention. I can go on. I think both Peter Rogers and Nøhr's about ambiguity and the political struggle in the central ministries were very interesting, and something new, which is not widely discussed. These political struggles within the central government is, I think, a new contribution. And then we had Søren Bech Christensen from our sister program talking about relations between the village and up to the district level. And here in the end, we finally got some fascinating insights from Philip from the Danish Embassy, I think, on their thinking and the progress of. And I think we should keep in mind that this is a very new project. It's just started, and there seemed to be willingness to learn and further develop it. And of course, this is political struggles which were at the national level, which have moved down to the county level, and of course things are going to go wrong, but slowly there's perhaps I'm optimistic in terms of that slowly becomes we develop a system which actually provides adaptation support to those in need. We had the Millicent presentation of vulnerability and whether it reflects donor support in Turkana, and we have the other case from Meru district in Tanzania. So I think I go away optimistic, even though there was a lot of depressing thoughts on the way, and I think we will write this up in a book now, which hopefully comes next spring. So thank you very much for coming today.